Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us from Stone Age cannabis to Rome's Bloodsport and scandalous queens. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps. And share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. We begin not with a philosopher's syllogism or a conqueror's trumpet, but with a plant, a modest stalk that has confused, soothed, clothed, fed, and mildly exasperated governments for thousands of years. Around 5000 BC, in the chill and quiet of the Stone Age when pottery was a new trick. Animals were learning to live beside us, and a mosquito bite could still pull a thread that unraveled a life someone on the Eurasian steppe pulled wild cannabis from a patchy bank of soil. Utility came first. The long fibers twisted into cord, the cord braided into rope, the rope into nets, belts, and lines that held the everyday world together. Seeds, small and glossy, roasted on hot stones beside fish and grain. Stalks dried on racks near the water as families learned a new rhythm harvest. Soak, beat, spin. If there is a first moment of a smoke, it hides itself gently in the archaeological record. Perhaps a forager, cold and impatient, tossed a handful of chaffy tops onto the fire to make it flare. Perhaps a hunter fed a green branch to the embers for light and found the air sweeter than before. Imagine the puzzled stillness that followed. No songs, no snacks, no cultural script, only a long breath and the sensation that the night sky had taken one step closer. No one told those first lungs what to expect. The mind widened, then drifted. A cluster of stars became a slow caravan. The questions grew tall where they stood. Burial grounds whisper that the plant mattered. In graves on old river terraces, archaeologists have found seeds, fibers, and tools that read like a list of cherished practical companions. Some of the dead were sent off with nets, combs, beads, and small offerings from plants that had made life's not work easier. The reasons, as ever, braid together. Was the seed pouch a talisman, a medicine chest, a reminder of work the way a fisherman might be buried with his hooks? Sacredness and usefulness rarely keep separate addresses. It is easy to picture both grief and gratitude at the foot of a mound. Send her with what helped her hands. Send him with what stilled his pain. And beneath the soil, a quiet plant took root in memory. Hemp. This plant's fiber-bearing form wasn't a miracle so much as a reliable neighbor. Strip the stalk, tease out the bast, spin it tight, and you had a thread that laughed at rot and a strain. Ropes held fishing nets that sailed through cold rivers. Cords bound timbers into sleds and huts. Bowstrings twanged with a note that promised supper. In places where early potters pressed cords into wet clay, you can still see the ghost of twisted hemp on the surfaces of ancient jars, a fingerprint of technique left by people who wanted vessels as strong as well as handsome. The plant was a Swiss Army knife. Before anyone had the knife, a single species offered food, fiber, oil, and if the wind of chance blew just right, the softening of a long day's edges. In such a world, medicine was not an aisle in a store, but a conversation with plants. The same family that combed and spun hemp by the river would know which leaves soothed a rash and which smoke settled a cough. If someone learned that a tea from the seed mashed into warm water helped calm a fever or that a poultice eased the stiffness in winter-bent fingers, they would pass it on. In the best library the Stone Age had their children's ears. Utility taught first. Reverence, if it came, arrived later, often through the door of gratitude. What we now call recreation would have seemed a thin word then. There were no calendars in kitchen drawers, no weekends. There were tasks finished and tasks waiting. When accidental inhalation gave way to deliberate experiment, it was less a party than a practice. The smoke makes the noise inside me quiet. This warmth takes the edge off the journey. If a cluster of cousins chose to sit close to the fire after the fish were cleaned, breathing the same air and talking a little more slowly, that was not hedonism. It was a kind of weather. And in this changing weather, humor arrived like a stray dog and stayed. Clouds became old friends. Trees gave excellent advice by saying nothing. The children fell asleep earlier, and the adults, in a rare kindness from time, felt the night loosen its knot. But the plant's shrewdness was not in intoxication. It was in persuasion. It found a species willing to plant it, harvest it, praise it, fear it, and pass laws about it, often within the same lifetime. Hemp did not need to conquer. It simply made itself useful and then waited. In the centuries that followed, the plant would hitch rides on trade paths, trail behind flocks, and take up humble residency in ditches and garden edges, so ordinary as to be invisible until someone needed a strong line, a little oil, a quick poultice, or a breath that cooled a hard thought. Think of the domestication curve as a river delta, many small streams of use flowing toward one wide sea of habit. First came seed and fiber, then oil and cordage, and only later the layered rituals. Redding pools where stalks soaked to loosen their fibers left a faint, earthy smell in village air. Spindles clicked and hummed in doorways. Nets dried across brush. Sandals stitched from woven strips sat by the threshold. To live in such a house was to be surrounded by the quiet geometry of hemp braids and weaves and coils that took the strain so that people did not have to. Even without words for supply chain, the household of early farmers understood resilience: store seed, dry stalks, keep a skein of cord at hand. We often tell the story of early humans as if they stumbled into meaning by accident. But this plant suggests something gentler. People noticed what worked, and then they noticed that what worked could also comfort. There is a difference between a tool and a companion. Cannabis learned to be both. A mother used a fiber strap to carry her child. An elder massaged aching wrists with a little oil. Someone who had taken a fall sat nearer the fire where the smoke was thicker and found the pain standing 2 steps farther away. If a feeling of well-being followed, it was folded into the invisible ledger of what the family believed, that winter could be outlasted, that small plants could do big work, that kindness sometimes arrived in the form of rope. Archaeology is careful. It speaks in fragments and probabilities. Still, the pattern that spreads across the map burial finds fiber remnants. Tools aligned to a task has the logic of a field after harvest. The lines run straight and true because many hands kept them so. This is not the story of a narcotic invading innocence. It is the story of a species that met us where we lived by the water, at the hearth, in the doorway at dusk, with the day's tasks finally quiet. Call it the oldest love-hate relationship because that is how human beings talk about anything that touches both body and mind, love the fiber that does not fail, the seed that fills a bowl, the little smoke that unties a knot inside the chest. Hate, or at least suspicion, the fear that a feeling too easy may be a kind of theft. The neighbor who uses the plant differently, the unease of elders who wonder whether the old disciplines can hold. That ambivalence will follow our story like a shadow, stretching and shrinking as the sun of each age moves across the sky. For now, sit with the simplest picture: a cold evening, a small fire, stalks stacked in bundles by the door, a spindle leaning in a clay jar, a family listening to the water as it talks itself to sleep. Someone feeds the embers a pinch of leaf and stem. The air changes personality. Laughter becomes easier. Silence becomes kinder. The plant has not yet collected its list of names and controversies. It is only a helper in the dark rope and thread and seed, and a gentle teacher of breath. By morning, the practical world will reassert itself. Nets must be mended. Cord must be twisted. The next field must be planned. But part of what carried humanity forward across those bare millennia, what kept us from breaking beneath weather and worry, was the humility to accept help where we found it. In hemp, the Stone Age found a patient ally, and once an ally has entered the house, history rarely shows it the door. If the Stone Age taught people what the plant could do for their hands, early China taught them what it could do for their nerves. The story opens, as Chinese stories of healing so often do, with Shennong, the divine farmer, whose Bronze Age silhouette stands somewhere between history and parable. He is remembered as the sovereign who tasted the world leaf by leaf, discovering which herbs cooled a fever and which sent a man to the ancestors. The book attached to his name, a spare, lap-sized catalog of roots and seeds, would not be compiled until many centuries later. Yet the lesson it preserves is older than ink. Cannabis belonged to the shelf of remedies, not to the basket of vices. It was a plant you measured, not a pastime you shouted about. They called it ma, the seed nutty, oily, calming, could be ground and stewed, a gentle medicine for a gut that refused to behave. The stalk, long fibered and stubborn, gave thread and rope. The resinous tops, dried and crumbled, were mixed into powders and decoctions that physicians brewed the way a careful cook tends a broth, watching not only the boil, but the person across the table. Shennong's classic assorts its contents by temper and a strength superior, medium, and lower grades, as if every herb had a personality, and cannabis's personality was useful but not flashy, something that steadied the wind inside you, and if you were greedy with it, might open doors you were not prepared to walk through. The Chinese genius for a system flows in here like a river finding its bed. A people who tuned their calendars to the pulse of the moon and mapped the body as an orchestra of organs and currents were never going to leave a plant like this to improvisation. Doctors learned to weigh and soak, to combine and counterbalance. One small packet to ease cramps, another with citrus peel and warming ginger to loosen a winter cough, a pinch in a soothing paste for creaking joints made miserable by damp. Most of all, the seed was praised for its moderation, not a club that knocked a symptom senseless, but a set of soft hands that helped it lie down. The bureaucracy noticed, because the bureaucracy noticed everything. The same hemp that softened pain also held the empire together by the mile. Out in the villages, retting pools steamed gently while men and women broke and combed the stalks. In town, skeins of fiber went taut under the touch of rope walkers, whose long sheds smelled of tar and dry dust. There were parchments and bamboo slips, yes, but as paper craft matured first as rough sheets from rag and bark, then as the refined pale leaves beloved by scholars, hemp put its shoulder under the written word. The earlier scraps were humble and fibrous. The later sheets were dignified and smooth, but they all whispered the same promise: a state can only be as careful as its records. So tax rolls, notices, poems, weather reports, and love letters passed through hands washed faintly green. The medical texts began to gather like careful birds on a reed. They speak in the plain poetry of physicians. This eases pain, that unbinds the bowels. Take too much, and the spirit runs about. The herbalists, who copied and glossed Chenong's short list, added the cautions that belonged to long practice. They knew that the same substance that calmed could, when squandered, agitate, that a medicine is not a god, but a guest, welcome when invited, tedious if it lingers. They dreamed in yin and yang, in dryness and damp, in cold that grips and heat that scatters, and they placed Ma among the middle voices, the ones that hush the quarrel rather than winning it outright. In the highlands and market towns, you might see a traveling doctor unpack a slatted box and set up shop on a mat. He takes pulses 3 ways, watches the tongue like a weather sky, and then, without a ceremony, mixes a powder that includes ground hemp seed with other friends from the field for the stubborn heat, he says, or for the wind that has taken hold of your muscles. The patient bows, pays in copper and thanks, and carries home an envelope that smells faintly of leaf and earth. There is no fevered romance to any of it, no haze crowding the room, only the unspectacular kindness of relief. And yet, the legends do what legends must they collect around the bright edges of a practice. In later centuries, stories would swirl about the surgeon who prepared patients with an anesthetic wine, the numbing powder that folded pain into a deep sleep, so that a stone could be cut from flesh or bone set straight. Whether the recipe's heart was cannabis or something like it danced in the cup beside other herbs, the image endures of a healer who trusted plants to dim the torch of agony long enough to save a life. It is not a tale of oblivion, but of mercy, not a flight from reality, but a way to hold still inside it. Meanwhile, hemp fed the ordinary day. Women spun and wove it into cloth that was honest rather than glamorous, the kind of fabric that did a farmhand more good than a poet. Fishermen trusted hemp lines to grip wet knots. Porters wrapped their waists in hemp belts, grateful for the strength that did not cut the skin. Boys learned to twist cord by the hearth the same week they learned to read. If silk was the empire's silk screen portrait, the gleam it showed the world hemp was the scaffolding you took down before the festival, sweeping away the evidence that labor had been here all along. The government cared how people felt, but only in the way a steward cares enough to keep them working, enough to keep the grain flowing, enough to prevent the kind of despair that burns stores and takes hostages. When doctors said that a seed mash could help a man sleep when his joints screamed, The magistrate nodded because the ledgers preferred men who slept. When the county clerk's mother stopped complaining of her belly after a course of powders, the clerk's brush wrote numbers straighter the next morning. Healing in such a culture did not stand on a stage. It wove itself into the private life that made public life possible. Inside the monasteries and private libraries, scholars sketched the plant the way they sketched mountains without fuss, and with a steady love of pattern. They traced the lobes of the leaf as if tracing a character's strokes, the up flick, the down sweep, the small pause before the lift. They wrote small notes to themselves about dosage and temperament, not for the very young, warming in winter. Be sparing with the resin in those who are easily startled. They were not prudes. They were administrators of the body, and their task was balance. If a cough came with heat, you cooled. If a pain came with cold, you warmed. If a mind came full of crashing waves, you waited for the tide to turn and helped it along with seed and broth. There were, of course, frowns. Every culture grows a stern uncle who believes the heart should never be light unless it has earned the right, and China's was no different. Some teachers muttered that even the idea of a plant that could comfort without effort invited laziness in thought. A Confucian master might clear his throat and remind a room that character is a daily labor, not a dose. The way of order is unglamorous. Wake early, sweep, write, greet, yield, correct your own faults before entertaining anyone else's. You could almost hear the scratch of the brush as he finished the sentence. Even so, behind the lecture, a jar of seed might rest on a shelf at home, and a wife might make a small porridge for his aching wrist. Principles run on rails, people sleep in beds. If you could stand in a lane outside a Han-era apothecary just before dusk, you would smell the civilized world at work, vinegar from a dumpling stall, smoke from the brazier, paper dust, a hint of dried peel, and that clean, slightly green aroma from a stack of hemp twine. A clerk emerges with a wrapped parcel for a grandmother's niece. Across the way, a civil servant rolls up the day's dispatches. A boy chases a hoop, and the hoop's rim is bound in hemp. Nothing is exotic here. Cannabis is not an event. It is a fact. And that is the point. In early China, the plant had already achieved the most enduring kind of fame, the sort that makes itself unnecessary to notice. It lived in the ledger and the loom, in the doctor's recipe and the fisherman's knot, in the small spaces where human beings slip from suffering into function. The later world will give it costumes and controversies, will raise it up and drag it down as fashion turns. But for a long, practical season, Ma was simply part of how a great civilization kept its breath even and its hands busy. Across the grass oceans of Central Asia, where thunder sounds like hooves and the horizon keeps its promises, people learned a different grammar for this plant. No apothecary shelves, no measured decoctions, only fire, stone, and breath. They were riders more than settlers, archers whose childhoods smelled of leather and horse, painters who wore their art under their skin in coils of ink. Herodotus, the Greek who loved other people's stories almost as much as his own, met their ceremonies with a certain dazzled respect. He tells us that the Scythians, those wind-burnished nomads of the steppe, heaped hemp onto heated stones within low, sealed tents. In moments, the darkness thickened with aromatic clouds, and the people within raised their voices, laughing and crying out in a single sound that startled those who had not learned to breathe in that kind of weather. It was not a tavern. It was not a prank. The tent stood like a small temple, and the stones were its altar. In that cramped, glimmering space, smoke climbed and circled, and the living visited their dead. The ritual was awake, awash, ascending. Grief, in the open grass, has no walls to lean on. The tent provided them, trembling a little as shoulders brushed the canvas and hands fed the glowing stones. When the first wave of heat pressed against the skin and the second rolled through the chest, men and women felt the world tilt just enough for memory to slip into the present. In his awkward Greek, Herodotus calls it delight, but anyone who has stood under an avalanche of feeling knows that delight can carry sorrow in its arms and not spill a drop. Archaeology, with its patient brush, found confirmation where the story had already left a map. In burial mounds, the kurgans that rise like quiet knuckles across the plains, excavators lifted small braziers, stone-lined pits, and, in one remarkable tomb, hammered gold vessels whose interiors kept a chemical ghost of what had burned there, cannabis resin, sometimes tangled with opium's darker smoke. Elsewhere, in dry mountain tombs where preservation felt like a second, colder life, entire caches of female flowers carefully harvested, seed-laden, potent, lay beside the dead, as if the living expected their companions to need comfort on whatever road came next. Saddles, bows, quivers, mirrors, combs, a harp's delicate frame, and this plant weapon, music, beauty, and balm in a single luggage set for eternity. Picture a night from such a world. 20 riders unlace their boots and duck into the tent. The sweat of the day is sharp. The leather's smell is old and sweet. In the center, a shallow tray mounds with stones that remember earlier fires. Someone tips a handful of coarse seed and leaf onto the heat. Another fan lifts and falls. The first breath tastes like green wood, the next like honeyed hay. Voices quiet, then rise the old tongues that are more sung than spoken. A hand touches a shoulder alive, present, and for a few minutes the ones they love who are gone feel as near as the horse outside, snorting at a moth. We are tempted now to call this recreational, but the steppe has no patience for our grocery store labels. The Scythians who entered those tents carried a memory of battle smoke too, and the smell of a pyre, and the way a father's saddle sounds when it is lifted down the last time. The plant folded itself around those memories, not to erase them, but to make their edges kind. If the living sometimes emerged dazed and grinning, it was not because they had forgotten duty, it was because duty had, for an hour, forgotten to bite. The plant was not only for ritual, its fibers tied gear to the backs of horses, its cords stitched leather into effectiveness, its oil-soothed skin cracked by the same sun that baked the plains. The nomad's house is small, but the inventory of its usefulness is long. In that way, the plant carried its Stone Age reputation forward into the saddle helper of hands by day, bearer of breath by night. News travels across a steppe in two ways, on wind and on horseback, and both carry this style of use to neighbors. The idea that fire and a fragrant smoke could bridge the visible and the invisible rode west to the kingdoms between rivers and east toward the high plateau. Among the peoples who traded with the Scythians, the plant acquired new names and manners. A Zoroastrian priest standing before a clean flame added a pinch to the air as if to sweeten a prayer. A caravan cook learned that a spoonful of ground seed in a stew quieted the complaints of a long day's walking. A philosopher, reflective under a starlight, found that his questions made a gentler sound when the night carried a thread of scent from the brazier. The tent itself, its low roof, its esteem, its decision to hide the world for an hour had cousins in other lands. In northern forests, sweat lodges spoke similar languages with different trees. In mountain hamlets, bathhouses made of stone and cloud offered their own medicine. What the Scythian hotbox added to the global grammar was the clear intention that the smoke should be a vehicle, not a thief. It carried, it did not steal. The difference matters. Thieves leave the room messy. Carriers return what they borrowed. Herodotus, whose ear for drama sometimes outpaced his ear for nuance, lingers on the sound inside the tent, those cries of joy, as if to assure his readers that these were not reluctant participants. But he also records with a reporter's steadiness the rest of their lives, the horse rights that kept a people fed, the fiscal bluntness of a society without much taste for palaces, the paradox of warriors who tattooed their bodies with animals and then moved with the stalker's quiet. To those lives, the plant added not artifice, but amplitude. Sorrow rang truer, relief came cleaner. The boundary where breath becomes a spirit felt just for a moment less like a cliff and more like a slope. The gold vessels fascinate us because gold always does. But the everyday tools tell you more. Clay pots blackened with smoke. A rounded stone polished to a gloss no river could manage, only 1,000 small burnings can do that. A bone harpoon whose rim is stained the color of late summer fields. These are not the props of decadence. They are the utensils of a practice that survived precisely because it respected the line between solace and surrender. And yet, like water, culture takes the shape of its cup. When this plant and its smoky grammar entered more settled cities, the cup changed. In market lanes where poets argued beside spice sellers, people discovered the plant's talkative side. In courtly houses where propriety dressed itself in long sleeves, small gatherings borrowed the tent's intimacy without the stone or the sweat. The ritual that began as a wake learned to be a party, and, on its better nights, a philosophy. Back in the steppe, the Kurgans keep their own counsel. The dead lie with their horses, their weapons, their mirrors the world held in a handful of objects. All honest, all used, the plant lies there too, seed and flower bagged in leather, an affidavit of value more sincere than any law. For the Scythians, this green thing of the ditch and the camp edge had earned a seat on the boat across the last river. That is not fashion, that is faith. And when the riders moved on, as they always did, the plant moved with them, not as a conqueror, not as a contraband, but as household goods, coils of cord, a pouch of seed, a habit of breath. Along the trade paths that braided the world together, you could follow its trail by the way rooms changed. A circle of friends sat a little closer. A corner of the air grew contemplative. Grief found a ritual. and ritual found its song. Soon, farther south and east, another civilization would take this traveler in and give it a new mask, no tent this time, no glowing stones, but cups raised in the names of gods, and a milk-sweet drink lifted on festival nights as if it were a hymn, the same plant, the same soft correction to the noise inside, now robed in sanctity and accompanied by drums. But that is a story for the next mile. For now, remember the tent, the stones, the hand that fans the smoke, the breath that steadies, the laughter that is not disrespect but relief. On a plain that breeds stoicism, a plant found a way to let sorrow sit down without shame. And when the canvas flap opened at last, and the rider stepped into a wind that smelled of grass and horse, the world was unchanged and easier to bear. South of the steppe, the plant crossed a line that is older than law, from something useful and comforting to something holy. In India, it received a new name that sounded less like a tool and more like a title bhang, and another older name whose meaning tells you how people felt about it. Vijaya, victory. The Atharva Veda, a text that gathers together charms, cures, and quiet technologies for surviving the human condition. Lists the plant among sacred companions meant to loosen fear's grip. The tone is practical, not ecstatic, the tone of a household that knows storms by their first drop. But somewhere between the kitchen and the shrine, the plant acquired a smile. To many who touched it, this leaf was a gift. The gift, in stories, comes from Shiva. One path of the legend says he found the plant beneath a celestial tree and discovered that its cool fragrance steadied the spinning world. Another says that after drinking the poison churned from the ocean, his throat blew with the effort Shiva was offered the green, milk-sweet drink to quiet the heat. Either way, it is less a story about intoxication than about balance. A god who absorbs danger so the world can continue is given something gentle in return. Devotees took the hint. On his festival night, Maha Shivaratri, they keep vigil, chant his names, and lift clay cups of bhang the way one lifts a hymn. The drink itself is part recipe, part rite. In courtyards and temple kitchens, you see the same choreography leaves and tender tips washed and dropped into a stone mortar. Almonds, melon seeds, and a small constellation of spices, cardamom, fennel, black pepper pounded to paste, a ribbon of milk, a spoon of ghee, sometimes a drizzle of rose water or sugar, the pestle working until the mixture turns fragrant and green. The first, pour into a clay cup cool hot, looks like the spring and tastes like something a grandmother might approve if she was in a forgiving mood. Offered as prasad, consecrated food, it carries not permission, but blessing. The scene at night is not a revel so much as a vigil that happens to be joyful. Bells rise and fall, conches sound, the air is thick with incense and the white smoke of ghee lamps. Sadhus, ascetics with matted hair, and the ash of sacred fires on their skin, warm their hands around small clay pipes and pass them side to side in a rhythm that is closer to prayer than to pastime. They call Shiva Bhole, innocent, simple-hearted, and aim to match his clarity by paring life down to its breath and its repetition. Where the leaf assists that quiet, it is welcomed. Where it would cloud, it is set aside. The line is not policed by guards. It is kept by habit and the unshowy ethics of those who have to live with their minds in the morning. In villages away from the festival lights, bhang appears as a cousin to hospitality. A wedding procession pauses at noon. Men sit beneath a banyan. Someone brings a jug of thandai, cool and perfumed, with only a shy amount of the green stirred in late spring, when the first hint of heat presses on the neck. An old man who does not sleep well takes a spoon from a jar and mixes it into his evening milk. It is medicine in the local sense of the word, something that restores proportion. It is not an escape hatch, it is a weight on the other side of the scale. The physicians kept their own notebooks. Ayurveda, with its grammar of humors and seasons, speaks about the plant the way an experienced boatman speaks about wind. In small measures, mixed well and aimed at the right complaint. It settles nausea, sharpens appetite, and reminds stubborn muscles to release their fists. The texts also write down the cautions that wisdom accumulates too much, and the mind wanders into the hills and forgets to come home too often, and the hands prefer the pillow to the plow. There are recipes with ginger to wake digestion, with ghee to carry the effect gently, with aromatics to anchor the head. The instructions sound like a grandmother too, not on an empty stomach, not in the wrong weather, and never without respect. Every culture that loves something invents 3 versions of it: the everyday, the festival, and the secret. India was no different. Every day was the low, legal leaf, the bhang, that flavored drinks and sweets. Festival was the same leaf blessed, shared, and sung over. Secret was the stronger resins gathered from mountain sankaras in one dialect, a name that crossed borders and learned other pronunciations. Mountain pilgrims, traders, and wandering monastics packed the resins for long roads the way a singer packs a tuning fork, not to create the note, but to find it quickly when the air is thin. What surprises an outsider is not exuberance, but choreography. The plant is folded into protocols older than most dynasties. Offer to the god first. Share with the group, not to isolate yourself, but to be more available. Take it after food. Do not give it to someone who does not know what it does. Sleep if you can. Bathe in the morning. These are not laws, they are habits that keep pleasure from becoming carelessness. The same households that hang marigolds at the door and draw rice paste designs at dawn to welcome luck well, on certain days, grind a handful of leaves and say the same silent welcome to ease. Holy Spring's riot of color has its own green underpainting. The play begins in the lanes with powders and laughter, but before noon an auntie will press a sweet, green-laced laddu into your palm or hand you a glass whose surface glows like young wheat. The point is not oblivion, it is permission. Grudges are brushed away with pigment. Old quarrels are rinsed by a splash of water. The boundary between house and street, like the boundary between seriousness and play, softens for a day. The plant is not the star of that theater. It is the nudge that helps the curtain rise. There are clarifications that belong here because myths, especially happy ones, bred quickly. Not every village drank deeply, and not every sect approved. Householders with a taste for exactness scolded quietly that afternoon naps were better for crankiness than cupfuls. Moralists pointed out that anything which made young men sing louder than their worth should be viewed with suspicion. Even among worshippers of Shiva, the green cup was not universal. Many offered flowers and fruit and an uncluttered mind, preferring the coolness of water poured over the linga to the coolness of milk poured into themselves. The culture is wide. It contains both the cup and the refusal of the cup, both of them devotions if done with a straight heart. The plant's language diversified as it traveled. Ganja, a word that likely began in Sanskrit and learned new sounds in Hindi and Bengali, referred to the flowering tops. Bhang stuck to leaf and tender stem. Kauras named the raisin coaxed from the plant by sun-warmed palms. These distinctions matter to vendors and to priests. You do not offer your god the wrong thing any more than you offer your guest the wrong tea. The temple keeps one jar, the merchant another, the law, when it finally wakes and takes an interest centuries later, mislabels both and stumbles away satisfied. In the background of all this is work. India's holiness is noisy bells, songs, clatter, but its holiness leans hard on habits: broom at dawn, rice rinsed twice, sandals left at the threshold, lamp lit at twilight. The plant, in its honored forms, fits these habits like a small tool fits a calloused hand. It lets the mind breathe in the middle of dust. It makes patience a shade easier in weather that asks too much of the body. It puts a little gold leaf on grief so that grief will eat. It does not replace the rosary, the mantra, the squinting labor of becoming kind. It sits beside them, as honest as a bowl. Travelers noticed and copied, as travelers do. A Persian poet writes of a herb that loosens the knots of argument. A Central Asian merchant adds a handful of leaf to his own festival drink and thinks fondly of a night far away when drums beat until dawn. But if you trace each imitation back to its well, you find the cup in a courtyard, the quiet mortar, the laughter that cannot help itself after midnight, and the God whose job is to carry a universe on his shoulders and who, like any worker, takes his drink break. The story in India is not that a plant made people dreamier. People have always known how to dream. The story is that a plant found a precise place in a large ritual grammar as medicine when pain is bigger than pride, as sacrament when joy must be lifted and offered, as companionship when the second hour before dawn is lonelier than the first, and prayers need one more breath to rise. If the Scythian tent taught the world how to sit with the dead, the Indian courtyard taught the world how to sit with the gods and then with one's neighbors, who are, on a good day, nearly the same thing. Leave the courtyards and festival kitchens of India and step into a workshop, a loom's a steady clatter, twine humming across calloused palms, a tripod pot of oil hissing on a small fire. Here the plant loses its halo and becomes a set of excellent behaviors. The same leaf that could be offered to a god breaks into fibers that don't rot when soaked, cords that don't surrender when strained, paper that doesn't crumble when folded, seed that doesn't spoil when stored. If the temples taught how to sit with the divine, the workrooms showed how to stay alive through winter. China, practical as rain, had learned this early. Fields of hemp brushed the wind like green fur, and villages learned the plant's temperament as one learns a friend's. Stalks retted in a slow water, their gummy pectins persuaded to loosen their grip. the stems split lengthwise with patient thumbs, long bast strands combed and cleaned until they sang. The thread they made survived rain, sweat, salt, and the long reach of time. Fishermen trusted it because fish had no respect for weak rope. Scribes trusted it because ideas deserve homes that outlive the mouth that says them. A sheet made from hemp rag took ink well, endured folding, and could be sewn into a bundle that outlasted dynasties. It is a tame miracle to learn that some of the earliest written memories in East Asia sat on hemp civilization's diary kept, for once, on a plant that had already clothed the diarist. The list of uses reads like a carpenter's creed. Coarser weaves for sacks that won't surrender to grain. Finer weaves for shirts that soften with honest wear. Sandals that could be rewoven when a strap failed at the roadside. Bowstrings whose quiet as strength sent arrows true. Padding for armor where steel rubbed a skin raw. Rigging for riverboats that had no patience for pretty knots. Wicks for lamps drinking the pale, nutty oil pressed from seed. When war was a rumor, the same ropes tied bundles and cradles. When war arrived, they pulled siege engines. A single plant, one vocabulary, 1,000 sentences, all of them useful. The seed, small and convincing, had its quiet work as well. Porridge in lean months, a scatter over flatbread, a mash to coax the shine back into a tired ox's coat. Oil that burned cleanly in lamps shaped the evening enough light to mend a net. Copy a line, count a child's breaths. Nothing here was romantic. It was simply what you did so that there would be a tomorrow. Trade routes are less maps than habits, and the habit of usefulness travels faster than songs. The plant rode in sacks slung over donkeys, tucked among pottery the color of river mud. A bale of fiber changes no man's religion. It changes how long his boat lasts. So as caravans moved west, the plant's piety shed its bells and kept its manners. In Persia, it shook hands with water. Rope is only an argument you win once. The good rope remembers and the bad rope forgets. And Persian sailors, like all sailors, had no patience for forgetful materials. Hemp took dye well enough to satisfy market stalls and held knots with a memory that made dock workers smile. If philosophers in port cities argued about the soul's destiny, it was hemp rope holding their boats while they did. Egypt, organized by the Nile's breath, found the plant in two directions at once. The craftspeople had fingers that listened to materials flax for linen when you wanted coolness and sheen, hemp when you wanted endurance and a conscience unbothered by mildew. Fisherfolk needed lines that could be hauled wet 1,000 times and not turn to lace. Labor gangs needed cords that made scaffolds trustworthy in sun so hard it bent the horizon. In rooms that shared a wall with sanctuaries, oils were warmed and perfumed for balms to ease joints and swollen limbs. The medical papyri that survive read like careful grandfathers try this. When heat has taken a person's temper, this when the limbs complain of fire at the joints. Gather a little resin here, a little oil there, crush, mix, apply. Watch the person, not the recipe. Most of it is older than doctrine. All of it is human. Greece received the plant with exactly the mixture you would expect from a people who built their cities from argument. Hemp became both rope on ships and a topic in the air. You could see it as a practical friend it was in the rigging when a trireme gusted past. in the mending basket on a cottage stoop, or you could see it as a set of questions about moderation. Physicians, who counted themselves craftsmen as well as thinkers, wrote down that poultices made from the seeds a softened ache, and that the smoke might quiet a stubborn ear when other cures had sulked and failed. The social tone stayed measured. You do not need to make a rule every time something works. You need to notice the weather, the meal, and the person who must take it. By now, a pattern had set in. Where estates took themselves seriously, the plant made itself busy. Fortresses, harbors, marketplaces, the plant appears in inventories in the way salt does seldom celebrated. Always there. If a city's poets could spend an afternoon worrying politely about the boundary between pleasure and loss, its dog hands had already decided. A line that doesn't rot is better than one that does. A sail sewn on hemp tape outlasts its rival. A cart bound with hemp rope rattles less. Morals were for counsels. Ropes were for the load. One could write a little love letter to the texture of the thing itself. Fresh fiber has a pale luster, a kindness to light that flax envies. Wet, it smells clean, like a field after a dog has run through it and shaken itself dry. Twisted right, the cords do not bite palms. Woven plain, the cloth breathes. Woven tighter, it resists. If all that sounds like praise, it is only the praise that any craftsperson would offer for a material that keeps its promises. As the plant walked the roads in skins and crates, it cultivated a different kind of empire, the soft, unannounced dominion of a thing that works. Kings with armies conquer and then must keep conquering. Hemp, indifferent to banners, simply becomes indispensable. Sailors swear by it, scribes swear at it when the nib catches, then swear by it when the page survives a generation of thumbs. Farmers trust it to lash a broken gate when the cow has decided to test the world a little. You could strip the temples from a region, and still you would need rope. You could close the taverns, and still you would need cord and cloth. The plant smiled, and the plant endured. This is not to pretend that pleasure had fled. Wherever humans had a free hour, resin and leaf traveled a more private road. Small pipes carved with more care than their owners admitted. Tiny cakes baked longer than any recipe required. A smoke that braided itself through other smokes and was difficult to blame for anything in particular. But the dominant lesson of these centuries is not intoxication, it is a structure. Hemp holds, hemp bears, hemp lets other parts of life lean and not topple. Stand now beside a river pier wood slick with moss, a wind snatching at hats. A bundle of papyrus or parchment or rag sits in a dry basket, and next to it a sheet of hemp-based paper waits for a hand to test its tooth. Beyond, a boat moves as slow as a thought and ties up to a bollard with a double turn and 2 half hitches. Exactly the kind of knot a grandfather teaches a child, because that knot will never embarrass you. On shore, a woman mends a bag with thread that has the boredom of daily excellence. In a nearby stall, a boy grinds seed for oil, which will run lamps tonight. Nothing in that little scene asks for applause. Everything in it would complain if removed. In this way, East met West long before merchants learned each other's weather. The plant taught a common language of rope and rag, paper and cloth. Empires that could not agree on gods or calendars agreed on knots. Later, the conversations would grow louder priests, rulers, and thinkers discovering in a smoke or syrup reasons to praise or worry. But before all of that, there was this patient grammar of making and mending. The plant had already done what so many conquerors tried and failed to do. It had become necessary. Head west with the caravans and the plant changes dialect again. In the clay tablet towns of Mesopotamia, healers kept lists as neat as brickwork oils, resins, seeds, leaves, directions for the sickbed and the incense burner. Among those lines, a word that sounds familiar through the dust, kunubu, shows up in recipes with verbs like crush, warm, anoint. The work is not mystical, it is domestic. A priest-physician stands at a brazier with a mortar, steam lifting from a bowl as if a small weather has been called into being. What matters is breath, the way the nostrils flare when pain is stubborn, the way a chest loosens when a sweet smoke curls across a room, no larger than a boat's cabin. The plant has stopped being a story and become a tool again, but a tool that knows the head as well as the bones. By the time those habits reach the high plateaus and gardened courtyards of the Iranian world, the leaf has learned new manners. If the steppe taught it how to roar and India taught it how to bless, Persia taught it how to speculate. Cities with names that feel like spices, Susa, Ekbatana. Ray breathed philosophy the way date palms breathe heat. The people there had words for law and light that could make a careful person pause Asha, the right pattern of the world, Druj, the lie that unthreads it. In such places, anything that moved the mind was going to be weighed on a fine scale. Fire temples kept the clearest boundary of all, a living flame tended day and night in quiet rooms, a ritual grammar that asked for exact breaths, exact steps, and a mind like clean glass. There, intoxicants were suspect, not because pleasure is wicked, but because blur is the cousin of falsehood. Even so, the larger neighborhoods beyond the temple walls were generous laboratories. Perfumes simmered in copper, rosewater condensed in coils, and households collected aromatics the way a library collects verbs. Frankincense arrived in goatskin bags from the south, myrrh from farther still. The green leaf and its resins joined that chorus, not as a king but as a section in the orchestra, another note you could add when a mood needed tuning. Philosophers did with it what philosophers do with everything. They asked what kinds of thought it encouraged and whether those kinds were tools or toys. A man who had debated the fate of the soul before breakfast did not need help to wander. What he wanted was assistance in tracing a line straighter, longer, or more merciful. One wrote that certain smokes remove hardness from the mind the way oil removes a stiffness from a hinge. Another warned that a sweetness which arrives too quickly sends debts to the next day's ledger. Neither was entirely wrong. If you want to see how a culture truly feels about something, go to its thresholds. In Persia, the thresholds were caravanserais, walled courtyards that opened to the road at dusk like the palm of a hand. Traders tied animals to stone rings, dropped bundles in the shade, and when the work of counting and vouching was done, they took out their small comforts. Some brought stringed instruments that could turn the dust to honey. Some produced cakes of resin wrapped in cloth the color of a dried fig, pipes the length of a wrist bowls blackened by years, a coal coaxed alive from the cooking hearth. The ritual is informal but precise. 4 men sit with their backs to the wall and pass the ember clockwise so no one can say anyone else hurried. They talk of weather, tolls, rumors of war. When the resin meets the coal, the conversation slows, not from a stupidity, but from care. Ideas arrive as if on foot rather than on horseback. Opinions are allowed to grow their proper number of legs. This did not please everyone. Authority, like a hawk, does not admire gatherings it did not call. Rulers who welcomed incense at the palace gate became skittish when the same incense crossed from altar to alley. It is an old pattern. A scent is dignified when burned by the high priest and suspicious when burned by a scribe on his night off. Edicts appeared that used polite words, order, restraint, decorum, but meant, as edicts often do, hush. They did not entirely work. The leaf slid as easily through society as a rumor and, like a rumor, drew its power from being modest and portable. Doctors kept their steadier pace. Those who wrote in Middle Persian and the later physicians who wrote in Arabic and Persian together sorted the plant into familiar drawer seed that could be pounded into a paste for a stubborn stomachs, or applied warm to joints that complained. Leaf that, softened in oil, might quiet a brow that kept inventing a storms. Resins that could be too strong for a younger man's pulse, and so were better approached with the training wheels of other herbs. None of this is glamorous, which is why it endures. The people who hold a civilization together, midwives, bathhouse attendants, cooks, people who know where to place a brazier in a draft, rarely speak loudly. They do not need to. Their results speak for them. Poets, of course, spoke as if language were a carpet they could unroll and ride. In their verses, the plant appears as a shadow and allusion rather than name, hugging the edges of metaphors about gardens at night, about a cup that lifts burdens without spilling, about a friend who arrives with patience when the guest called sorrow overstays. These are not advertisements. They are acknowledgments that certain aids exist and that discretion is one of their better qualities. If a mystic hinted that a small cloud in a small room could make the heart less defended, he also insisted that clouds are not ladders. Hard work, prayer, service, the long apprenticeship to kindness remained the road. What did the day look like? Then, in a city where such tools were available, imagine a stone lane between garden walls. At dawn, a fire temple boy carries a covered ember from the sanctuary to the smaller household altars that will borrow its flame. A physician walks past, counting pulses with 2 fingers as he goes, thinking about a patient whose appetite returned only when his wife added something green to his milk. A philosopher rolls up a reed mat and mutters to himself about the difference between clarity and comfort. By afternoon, the traders have returned to their ledgers. A perfumer is minding a copper still where rose petals collapse into a vapor that will be trapped and tamed. Near sunset, a group of artisans sit against a wall whose plaster is warm from the day and share a pipe that smells faintly of pine and spice. After one circuit, they stop, tell a story, and let the sky change color. Every act in that little calendar belongs to a larger ethic. Do not waste flame. Pay attention to breath, seek truth, remember the body, Share, not all stories that traveled from this region aged well. Later writers elsewhere, centuries on, took the smell of these evenings and tied it to knives because fear sells faster than nuance. They gave new names to old rumors and pretended that patience is a code word for violence. Even then, the quieter record continued underneath medical notes, recipes, poems tucked into sleeves as blessings, not orders. The plant had already chosen its posture here, eyes soft, back straight. If you listen for empire in this chapter, you hear it hissing and popping in the still rooms as much as marching on roads. Empire is a way of turning materials into policy, metal into coin, water into canal, plants into law. The green leaf kept escaping that net by behaving like water, taking the shape of the vessel offered, turning incense in temples, medicine in kitchens, inquiry in courtyards, and only occasionally parade. It was stubbornly plural. You could not legislate it into one thing any more than you could legislate dawn into only pink. At last, the plant gathered its many identities and tucked them into saddlebags. East wind and west wind met at the ridge lines. Bales of fiber went one way, their usefulness uncontroversial. Small wrapped cakes went another, their usefulness best discussed in low voices. Philosophies went both directions, as philosophies do, and learned new answers to old questions. When the caravan bells jingled out of earshot, only the fragrance lingered in the lanes for a little while, the way an argument lingers after the participants have made peace and gone home. So Persia did not teach the world to be intoxicated. It taught the world to ask, before lighting anything at all, what the fire is for. If it is for worship, let the mind be bare. If it is for healing, let the measure be small. If it is for conversation, let patience be the largest part of the mixture. And if it is for forgetting, be honest about what is being left behind and whether it will still be waiting in the morning. A civilization that could hold all those sentences in one mouth made room for a green leaf without letting it run the household. That balance astern where it must be, generous where it can be, was the true invention. Follow the river that tells time. The Nile lifts and lowers its green eyelids, and along its banks a bureaucracy the size of a climate stands shoulder to shoulder with prayer. Here, cannabis does not arrive with trumpets. It drifts in with other traded things, resins that smell like warm churches, jars of oil the color of late afternoon, bundles of fiber that look like captured wind. Egypt receives it the way Egypt receives all materials by assigning it work. In the clinics tucked behind pylons, physicians copy remedies onto papyri with ink the shade of date pits. Their language is calm even when the patient is not. If the joints are angry, one line advises pound the seed and warm it in oil, lay upon the place. Another, for eyes that punish their owner, calls for a resin softened and married to fat, then applied with a reed. They do not promise miracles. They promise attention, pulse, breath, stool, sleep, because attention is how a person returns to themselves. The plant appears in this writing as a helper among helpers, never the star that steals the stage, always the steady second who keeps the scene upright. Women's rooms tell their own story. Midwives in linen aprons measure pain by the shape of a face and the set of the shoulders. They keep baskets of small things that matter: clean cloth, a clay mug for hot water, a spoon for coaxing courage into the mouth, a jar of softened herb, green ones, brown now that can blunt a contraction's hard edge or soothe the pelvic ache that lingers like weather. In a world without anesthesia, compassion learns chemistry. Recipes survive that speak carefully of warming and infusing, of inserting a medicated plug the way one places a blessing gently, without hurry. It is not defiance of the gods. It is partnership with them. Temples fold the plant into ritual in quieter ways. A priest draws a brazier's breath with a fan of palm, and the air changes personality. Incense has always been a bridge: grief to acceptance, petition to patience. In certain rites, a touch of green resin rounds the smoke's edges. Not enough to tip the mind off its feet, only enough to loosen the fist that grips the chest when sorrow or fear insists on ownership. When worship ends, the brazier is covered. No one here confuses the oar with the boat. Egypt's craftsmen give the leaf a different biography. They judge fibers by what water does to them and by how long they can be asked to remember a knot. Flax is the fine shirt for a feast day. Papyrus is a good soldier given paper's duty. Hemp, when it is at hand, is the stout friend who suffers the work no one writes poetry about. Lines for fishing that return wet 1,000 times, lashings for scaffolds when stone wants to rise, straps for sandals that must not surrender in mud, cords to hiss when pulled through oarlocks. Then forgive. The climate is brutal to weak materials. The plant, properly treated, holds. Not everything is certainty. Words wander over centuries. A term written as shemshemet in some medical scrolls may be hemp, maybe something cousin to it. The ingredients have outlived their labels, and scholars argue in the margins the way uncles argue after good wine politely, then less so, then with laughter, but the pattern does not need a perfect dictionary. Ointments for swelling, poultices for pain, smokes for temples and sick rooms. This is the grammar, and Egypt speaks it in a voice that sounds like the Nile when it is pleased. Turn north and west across the sea that tastes of tin and rumor. Greece receives the plant not with a procession, but with questions. Athenian mornings begin with broom-swept courtyards and the sound of sandals arguing with gravel. By noon, someone is already making a case at a shaded table. If there is a national pastime here, it is the conversion of daily life into thought. The plant enters as rope first, medicine second, subject of conversation third. In the shipyards, it belongs to the forearms. Hemp rope, twisted right, holds a trireme together the way mutual trust holds a phalanx. The sea does not negotiate. Sails must answer wind like a trained animal. Lines must be as dependable as memory, and anything that rots is an insult. You can tell how a material matters by the way men curse when it fails. Men do not curse hemp much. In the physician's notebooks, the plant keeps its practical manners. When ears burn and hum without cause, a warmed concoction seed softened in wine or oil, a whisper of resin might persuade the pain to leave by the nearest door. When joints complain as if a tiny god with a hammer lives inside them, the same seed ground and wrapped in cloth becomes a packet of heat. The great names keep their tone modest. A treatment helps or soothes. It does not conquer. One author notes that too many seeds dampen desire which is useful to know in a culture that treats appetite as a topic for ethics, not gossip. Another warns that smoke can amuse the head too much for an hour and recommends use that follows need, not mood. These are not sermons. They are instructions from one artisan to another. Then there are the rooms where men recline and let the evening try on different clothes. Symposium is a beautiful lie of a word, drinking together as if that were the point rather than the instrument. Between cups of wine softened with water, someone produces a packet as small as a folded letter, and the conversation's posture changes. It does not grow silly, at least not at first. It grows tender with possibility. A question is allowed to arrive without a challenge riding behind it. A shy man may bring forward an idea he has rehearsed for weeks. A bolder one may finally hear the answer he has been talking over. The smoke is not the argument. It is the oil on the hinge. Greeks love warnings almost as much as they love questions. Their literature is crowded with men who mistook a helpful thing for a purpose. So the plant receives the usual counsel. Use it to treat, not to flee. Let it make a conversation more generous, not less rigorous. Remember that the gift of a clear mind is not to make pleasure louder, but to make truth more bearable. A city that builds theaters to practice honesty in costume is not going to let a leaf become an alibi. Outside the cities, on islands where goats lecture the wind and the sea invents a new color before breakfast. The plant takes on local duties. A fisherman's wife keeps seed in a jar to sprinkle on bread in the lean weeks when fish have more opinions than mercy. A herdsman binds a splint with a strip of hemp and thanks the road when it does not give way beneath him. A boy mends a torn sail with thread that will outlast his first mustache. Philosophy is what a people do with the time that usefulness gives them. A thread ties Egypt to Greece, barely visible until you wet it with attention. Both cultures treat the plant as a citizen among citizens. It may stand in a procession, but does not carry the idol. It may sit at the table, but does not carve the meat. It wears neither halo nor shackles. There are places where the smoke rises before statues, and places where it rises before soup, and neither context terrifies the other. This is what maturity looks like in a civilization room for many roles and the discipline to keep them from changing places without permission. Now imagine a small coastal town where the two worlds brush sleeves. A merchant's warehouse smells of resin and linen and damp wood. On one shelf, bales of Egyptian flax and sacks of Levantine hemp share the shade. On another, jars of oil stand like a platoon of suns. A scribe from Naucratis arrives with a sealed letter. It's a string, a hemp thread waxed to a shine. In the courtyard, an Athenian doctor examines a sailor's swollen ear, shakes a packet of dried seed like a rattle, and gives instructions that are really a prayer disguised as grammar warm, soften, dab, rest. No one here needs to choose between temple and marketplace to understand what mercy looks like. By the end of this chapter, the plant has learned a habit that will carry it safely for centuries. It moves at the speed of trust. Where people trust craft and measure, it is welcomed as a thing to be weighed and used. Where people trust ritual, it is welcomed as a fragrance that shapes attention. Where people trust talk, it becomes a courtesy in the mouth of evening. There will be other places and louder voices that demand it be all medicine or all sin, all sacrament or all vice. But along the Nile's a steady breath, and beneath the Attic light that turns a stone to a lesson, the plant keeps its place, neither hero nor suspect, only useful, only kind. Cross another seam of water, and you come to Rome, a city that prefers what it can inventory. Hemp enters the empire not as a curiosity, but as a line item, bales declared at harbors, coils measured in fathoms, seed weighed on scales that also price fish. Rome's genius is administration. Even its miracles come with receipts. The plant is put to work before it is ever put to the lips. Begin in a rope walk, a long corridor of shadow and dust where boys backpedal, palms open, as the strands twist into cords and cords into cables. The air smells of fiber and a sweat sweetened by oil. A foreman tests the lay with a thumbnail and nods. This is not abstract craft. It is the difference between a harbor emptied by winter gales and a harbor speaking its usual language of commerce oars, curses, gulls. A trireme's rigging makes more demands than a senator's diary, and Hemp learns them all without complaint. In arsenals along the Tiber, at Ravenna, at Carthage, rope gets a soldier's pay earned, practical, unglamorous, indispensable. On land, it is no less busy. Tents need lines that don't surrender under rain. Supply wagons want harness that forgives friction. Field fences in windy provinces prefer a fiber that remembers its duties after sleet. In the provinces, farmers discover that the stalk grows obediently in soils that don't flatter wheat. They cut, ret, comb, spin, and teach their hands to love a material that is never precious but always faithful. The empire's bigness runs on small, tough things. Hemp is one of those quiet engines. Medicine, too, adopts the plant with Rome's a sober accent. In a physician's satchel, goat leather polished by years, a copyist's hand has copied a Greek master's notes into Latin margins. The book report without sentiment from the seeds, pounded and warmed. A liquor can be coaxed that soothes ear pain. Poulticed, the same mash softens swollen joints, swallowed immoderately. The seeds are said to dim desire and leave the body languid. Another entry suggests a small dose to settle gut frets. After an unfortunate dinner, a common Roman condition in a city that loves sauces as much as it loves victory. A later hand, practical as an apothecary counting coins, warns that smoke sharpens the head too brightly before it blunts it, and that patients needing sleep should receive warmth and oil rather than vapors. The tone is not pious or frightened. It is supervisory. In women's quarters, the plant keeps a softer vocation. Midwives exchange recipes the way soldiers exchange camp rumors. The best are tested. Simple and anonymous. A little pressed oil green memory diluted in olive gold goes into ointments for the belly that cramps without cause, or for hips that ache with the work of life. A cloth steeped and cooled, a suppository made with fat and a pinch of crushed seed, a whisper to breathe. These are rituals of a skill, not rebellion. The plant cooperates with an older medicine touch and time. Still, not all uses travel without gossip. Intoxication is a Roman subject with rules and loopholes. Wine is blessed by ancestry. To drink is human and in the right quantity. Roman moderation turning grape into grammar. Smoke, by contrast, speaks with an accent the moralists label foreign. The same men who sharpen their minds with Falernian grow censorious at the thought of a cloud that bypasses the tongue. It is not that the plant cannot be inhaled, it is that inhalation does not align with the city's favorite virtues gravitas, dignity, the tidy hierarchies of self-command. A man may loosen his belt, he must not misplace it. Respectability has a scent here, and it is not resinous. Stoic teachers preach that passions are to be attrained, not indulged. Epicureans reply that pleasure is a garden best tended carefully. Both the schools make room for healing fumes in sick rooms. Suffumigations are a known tool, yet both frown at leisure disguised as physic. The law does not thunder against the leaf. Rome saves thunder for treason, but social weather exists, and in that forecast, smoke is marked variable. Consult a wiser head. The wiser head, in practice, is often a household's matron. In a villa beyond the walls, a woman supervising a store keeps 2 jars separate, one of poppy heads for night terrors, one of dark seeds for the earache that troubles her youngest. She is the empire narrowed to a table keeping accounts, guarding health, arranging the world's indignities into bearable lists. When her husband returns complaining of a shoulder wrenched at the baths, she heats oil with a pinch of seed and rubs the skin until it warms under her palm. He sleeps. She marks the remedy with a small piece of wax and a notch in a tablet. No philosophy interrupts. In the markets, sellers learn to describe without inviting trouble. For nets, says one, patting a bale. For cords that will not rot, says another, weigh in a coil deliberately. An apothecary wraps a packet in papyrus and writes enough to signal its purpose, dolor pain. Oris ear, articulous joint without promising anything a god might punish. Under the awning's shade, truths negotiate with customs. It is how empires avoid unnecessary drama. Anecdotes accumulate as anecdotes do. A banquet host, eager to distinguish himself in a city jaded by spectacle, instructs his cook to scatter toasted seeds over honeyed desserts. Guests laugh more freely and announce the novelty clever. The same week, a moralist writes a paragraph about Roman decline and the perils of imported habits. Both are telling the truth they prefer. Neither is an edict. Rome specializes in contradictions that hold. At the edges where legions live, the plant assumes soldierly manners. In winter camps on the Rhine, a medicus grinds seed with vinegar to make a poultice for a centurion's knee. The man tells his cohort the pain obeyed as if under orders. Far away in a port of Africa Proconsularis, a shipwright splices a damaged hawser with hemp that drinks tar greedily and returns to duty. The empire is a body with many joints. The plant eases them in both sense and metaphor. It hangs also in doorways as a farmer's amulet, braided with other fibers and dyed with cheap joy. Superstition here is practical. A charm works if it cements attention, if it makes a household kinder to itself, if it persuades a tired man to straighten the tool rack and thereby avoid the cut that would have followed carelessness. Rome is not a monastery. It tolerates any small spell that keeps the day intact. What it does not tolerate, or not for long, is confusion of means and ends. When a young dandy tries to introduce hashish as a salon-fashion silk cushions, foreign burners, evenings of Persic mood, He discovers audiences have limited patience for imported haze. Guests attend once. Curious, they do not return. Rome has 1,000 ways to forget itself. Most of them involve the theater, chariot factions, or wine with people who can improve one's prospects. The leaf, when it seeks a stage, finds itself demoted to prop. Yet the same city that sniffs at ceremonial smoke would have no empire without Hemp's labor. Sails catch punishment from Mistral and Sirocco. Lines lash spars that groan like oxen. The sea eats what is weak. Hemp's humility is its supremacy. It works and therefore belongs. In a civilization that praises virtue in marble, but survives by carpentry, the plant wins by being good, wood's friend. Sometimes you can hear the whole Roman argument inside one small story. A Dr. Gray, unstartled, visits a townhouse where an old woman cannot sleep for the chorus in her bones. He notes the stiffness, the soft swelling at the knuckles, the way she rehearses the pain before it arrives. He warms oil with a pinch of crushed seed and perfumes it faintly so the room will remember tenderness. He rubs the joints, wraps the hands, and instructs her daughter, repeat at dusk for 7 days. No late wine, a walk in the early sun. He charges modestly and leaves. Down the street, a young man with too much money experiments with a brazier and an attitude. His friends cough and turn the evening into jokes. The empire contains both scenes. One will last longer than the other. By the time Rome is done sorting the plant, it has given it 4 registered addresses: shipyard, farmyard, surgery, kitchen. A 5th, a den for forgetting, never quite earns a citizenship. The distinction is not mystical, it is managerial. What helps us hold, Rome says, stays. What helps us evade, visits. The plant accepts the verdict and keeps working. And in the ledgers of an empire that once counted the known world the way a banker counts coins, usefulness is the closest thing to praise. Follow the long, low bell of a camel, and the world rearranges into caravan's tassels. Bells, goat skin water, sun like a brass plate. The Silk Road is less a road than a rumor that became geography, and along it the plant learns to change costumes. In one valley, it is medicine, in another devotion. Farther on, a tidy brick wrapped in cloth and sold with a wink. No soldiers escort it. It needs none. It travels as quietly as a spice. A merchant from Bactra inventories his pack beneath the blue noon silk that whispers, pepper that burns, a jar of pressed resin that doesn't spoil, easier to carry than leaves or flowers. For melancholy, he tells the tax clerk at the next way station. A line as old as commerce, the clerk, bored and careful, stamps his tablet in relay after relay, Khotan, Kashgar. Samarkand, the same conversation repeats in different tongues. The plant speaks them all, but always through other people's mouths. Every caravanserai is a parliament of tired feet. In the courtyard dust, Greeks argue prices with Zogdian middlemen. Indian handlers tend nervous horses. And a monk from Dunhuang sits very still listening to the world behave like water. After dinner, someone produces a pipe inlaid with bone. Another breaks off a corner of the brown brick and warms it with a coal. The smoke climbs a little staircase through the lamplight. Stories arrive a storm caught in a mountain pass, a guard who returned a coin he could have kept, a city farther west where chariots race and senators bet fortunes. Laughter takes the room by the hand. The plant is not the astar. It is the soft drummer in the back of the band, lending pulse. In temple towns and courts, the language around it shifts. Assyrian scribes in older centuries wrote of a gum called kunabu, fragrant, ritual, useful for the head that burns and the joints that complain. Persian priests learned to value incense that rises as if on purpose, and philosophers discover that a softened edge invites a longer question. Merchants absorb the customs as they absorb exchange rates, finding the pitch in each place that allows resin to move without argument. Out of Persia's ranges, a different story begins to grow, thorny and sensational. On a cliff-fast fortress named Alamut, a name that sounds like Talon, lives a leader who asks obedience and gets it, and his enemies begin calling his adherents Hashishiyin. The insult is flexible enough to stick weeds use any wall. Later, in the mouths of frightened chroniclers and returning crusaders, Hashishiyin softens, hardens, travels, turns into a word that will mean hired blade for centuries. There is theater in this and very little harvest. The archives, when you look patiently, are full of blueprints and discipline, not braziers in corners, not ceremonies of forgetting. But rumors walk faster than facts, and Europe prefers a story it can gasp at. It keeps the gasp and forgets the footnotes. Meanwhile, in cities where minarets turn first light into geometry, a quieter argument is happening. The Holy Book says no to wine, and men who love clear lines take that no and try to extend it to every intoxicant. Others, equally devout, point out that the text only names the grape, and that what heals a wound or steadies a nerve must not be condemned by name alone. Between the two positions, there is enough gray to host 1,000 evenings. The result is not lawlessness, but improvisation. Scholars with hands ink-stained from copying medical treatises note that the plant, prepared properly, can mollify spasm, bring appetite back to a man the heat has emptied, quiet a stomach that will not be admonished. They are as alert to harm as to benefit. Too much dims judgment. Taken young and constantly, it can make a boy lazy in his limbs and his intentions. Their language is the old clinical clarity doses, cautions, sober verbs. Their colleagues in law, alarmed by idle courtyards heavy with laughter, write stern phrases on paper that wears out a little faster than the habit they wish to erase. In Cairo, the resin finds its dens and its enemies. A sultan imposes a fine and a beating on those who chew it behind shuttered doors. Inspectors raid gardens where the plant grows with insolent cheer along canal banks. Disciples from certain wandering orders sing too freely and are punished with shaved brows and sermons. For a while, the crackdown works. Then the city shrugs, the way old cities shrug, and the habit migrates a few streets down. Markets have longer memories than proclamations. Move east again, and the plant enters a different grammar of worship. Sufi circles, those schools of breath and music, sometimes treat a pinch of leaf or a sip of green infusion as a key that helps the heart's door unstick. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that poems record it as if it were a metaphor that can also be swallowed. In their lodges, the evenings are built from chant and repetition, from the same syllables returned to until the tongue remembers what the mind forgot. The plant is not the trance. It is one of the candles in the room, helpful and not essential. If there are dens, there are also clinics. An old physician near the Tigris sits by a window stacked with jars, fenugreek, coriander, bitter aloe, and keeps a small pouch of dark resin next to scales that have learned the difference between promise and excess. He treats one man's knotting gut with a ball no larger than a chickpea, warns him not to take more without need, and sends him home with advice to chew fennel afterward. He turns away a boy with bright eyes and a shopping list written by boredom. Healing is not retail. Merchants learn the plant's retail anyway, pressed into thumb-sized tablets, stamped with the maker's mark, dyed with a little saffron to flatter the appetite, packaged so that a traveler can break and share without mess. Hashish becomes the form that suits the road, dense, portable, measurable. It sits well beside dates, making the tongue report later that the evening was kind and the music more precise than memory claims. A brick can cross a desert and still be itself. That is a commercial virtue no leaf can rival. All the while, language goes on doing what it loves, mischief. The slur for a sect hardens into a profession's name somewhere far away. The word for a pressed sweet in one market becomes the word for a vice in another. Not even kings can govern vocabulary. Poets, pleased by the ambiguity, write verses that allow a pious reader to imagine incense and a worldly one to imagine smoke. Some things are kept safe by being said twice at once. And yet for every parable of indulgence, there is the quieter arithmetic of craft. Rope makers along the Levant mix hemp with flax for lines that resist rot. Fishermen along the Black Sea patch nets with a thread that refuses to surrender. Paper makers in Syrian towns lay hemp rag into vats to make sheets that take ink like a willing student. In the same centuries that preachers denounce dens, scribes copy their sermons on hemp-strengthened paper. The irony is not malicious. It is simply the way usefulness disarms debate. We can chart the plant's root on coins and punishments, on recipes and songs. A magistrate's ledger in Damascus records a fine for public laughter unbefitting the hour. A phrase that could fit many things, but that night meant resin shared too openly. A poet in Isfahan thanks a green cup for giving the moon a second edge, and then asks forgiveness in the next line for wanting such edges. A farm wife in the Nile Delta keeps a single row of the plant to steep in oil for the husband whose back tightens at harvest. A beggar learns which courtyard door hides a generous hand and, on cool evenings, offers to tell a story better with a pinch of smoke. The plant is not a hero in any of these scenes. It is an instrument passed between players who know when to play softly. If you listen for crashes, you can find them men who vanish down the well of pleasure and prefer it to the day's work. Officials who use raids as theater and mercy as a private favor. But the larger pattern is less theatrical, a civilization negotiating, as civilizations do, between appetite and order. In that negotiation, the plant persists by being many things. Medicine when measured, courtesy when shared discreetly, trouble when paraded. Objects that survive across empires excel at changing their manners without changing their nature. By the time the great road begins to dim under new routes and new ships, resin has made itself at home from Maghreb to Punjab. It will cross seas next, tucked into sailors' sacks or listed politely on manifests as something safe and useful. For now, under a sky that pretends not to notice how hard people try to be at peace. A caravan sleeps. Somewhere in the courtyard, a coal glows and then remembers to go dark. The smell it leaves behind belongs to no single people and no single prayer, only to that human wish that conversations last a little longer and the body hurt a little less. When the plant finally slips into medieval Europe, it does so the way most ideas cross a guarded threshold, disguised as work. Ports need cordage more than philosophy. Barns need twine more than trance. In a century that counts virtue out loud and counts harvests in quiet, hemp earns its keep before it earns an opinion. The monasteries, those islands of ink and habit, notice this first. In their hortus square beds, bounded by boxwood and rule, they grow the reliable companions of a hard climate: onions, leeks, rue, sage, flax, and a modest stand of hemp. Stems are retted in ponds until the outer husk loosens, then beaten with mallets, combed with iron teeth, spun into thread that forgives rain. From such thread come ropes for bells, lines for wells, halters for oxen, cords for rosaries that pass 100 times through the same fingers and become smooth as water-worn wood. A lay brother with hands the size of shovels learns to twist 3 small strands into one larger obedience and teaches it to new novices, who will remember the lesson better than Latin. In the scriptorium next door, parchment still rules animal skin awakened to letters, but in towns where paper mills begin their whispering work, ragmen gather worn linen and hemp cloth, shred it to fluff, and send it to vats where wooden hammers beat the slurry until it yields a sheet that takes ink and dries to a patient gray. The plant enters the book not as subject, but as surface. Medicine returns to it with the caution of a cat at a new door. Herbals copied and recopied in crabbed hands catalog plants by temperament, hot or cold, moist or dry. Where the leaf is listed at all, it is assigned the sensible chores, soothe the buzzing ear, warm the stiff joint, loosen a stomach tightened by winter bread. A midwife, respected and suspected in equal measure, carries a small tin of greenish oil among her swaddles and linens. She rubs a drop into the back of a woman whose labor has become an argument with her own body, or onto the brow of a child tied with fever. No one in the room mentions the devil. The devil, when he visits, arrives in other shapes. Yet fear finds its custom too. Europe in these centuries is tired and devout. Famines arrive like uninvited bishops. Pestilence steps through towns wearing its crown of silence. Kings name wars after God and regret nothing. Into this weather come stories from east of the sea, carried by crusaders whose memories prefer drama dark rooms scented with resin. Men in turbans laughing while the world goes soft at the edges. A word that sounds like hashish, stretched into a slur that will later become a profession assassin. The sermons write themselves. What begins as gossip about foreigners becomes a mirror for local anxieties. Preachers learn to say herb of idleness, and audiences nod, relieved to have a phrase. Even so, the household keeps its own counsel. In a timbered kitchen where the smoke finds the same path every evening, a wife warms seed in oil to pour into a husband's ear that has throbbed since haying. The pain recedes like a tide knowing its place. In the corner, a child watches and memorizes which jar, how much, how long on the coals, and a little later the child will have a life in which someone will expect her to remember. The plant's apprenticeship to family continues, unreported, unremarkable, continuous as weather. Markets cover the rest. On saints' days, the town square smells of garlic and tallow, iron and rain. A rope seller stakes 4 pegs and throws loops from peg to peg until a tent of fiber grows around him. He boasts that his cords, dressed properly with pitch, will outlast 3 winters of salt wind. A weaver displays coarse hemp cloth alongside dearer linens rough for sacks and sailments, finer for shirts, you don't mind scolding. An apothecary with a scale that can tell the difference between honesty and excess wraps a small parcel of crushed seed in paper, writes Orium for ears in a hand that makes each letter stand at attention, and repeats the old cautions about heat and measure. In such places, official doctrine is only one voice among many, and not always the loudest. Clerical opinion divides as clerical opinion will. Some monastic writers, sharpened by privation and prayer, warn that intoxication confuses the soul's instruments. The devil loves fog, others, more practical. Allow that, in a world where the poor cannot always sleep for hunger, a swallow of warmed medicine or a puff of innocent smoke in a sick room is a mercy, not a sin. The parish priest, who knows the names of all the children and the nicknames of their fathers, preaches publicly against looseness and privately blesses remedies that let a widow carry water tomorrow. Hypocrisy and kindness keep company more often than we admit. The law, when it speaks, tends to speak sideways. No royal charter thunders against a plant that keeps ships from going to pieces. Charlemagne's old orders for estate managers listing what must be grown, stored, repaired, had already counted hemp among the necessities. Centuries later, a manor roll in Flanders compels tenants to bring so much fiber to the Lord's barn by Michaelmas, or pay in coin they do not have. Practical compulsion is the continent's deepest law. It outlives kings as easily as weeds outlive walls. And everywhere the plant meets water. Along the Scheldt and the Thames, men in tar-stained tunics smear hempen lines with pitch until the fibers shine like wet ravens. A barge takes its first breath and learns to lean into current. On the Baltic, where weather speaks in a minor key, fishermen trust nets repaired with yarn that remembers its strength even after a month of brine. In the Bay of Biscay, a sail stitched from a blend of flax and hemp returns from a blow bearing scars smaller than expected. Wind loves what resists it without drama. So do sailors. Rumor, however, is a faster vessel than any caravel. A bishop hears of a village where women gathered to eat a green sweet on Sundays, and an inquiry begins. The women are found to be sharing a sweetened ball of seeds and honey after Mass, a folk courtesy for sore backs and the long walk home. A fine is levied not for the sweet, but for laughter in the churchyard that lasted. Someone complains, too long. A chronicler writes the tale into Latin that makes it sound worse than it was. Later readers, forgetting the honey and the backs, remember only that laughter was punished and assign the cause to witchcraft. The century acquires another cautionary story without checking its facts. The plant does not care. It keeps doing its small work. It oils spinning wheels whose wooden hearts like to talk to themselves. It feeds geese when grain runs low. They complain less with a handful of seed among the chaff. In lean kitchens, a few drops of hemp oil stretch a stew that needed a stretching. None of this is intoxicating. All of it is survival. Every so often, because people will always try the locked door, a young man in a town adopts novelty as if it were a cousin. He burns a cone of resin in an upstairs room, invites friends, and for a season they go on about colors as if they had invented them. The fad exhausts itself. By Lent, they have moved on to arguing about a new hymn's meter. Pleasure that does not embed in labor rarely makes a home in cold countries. There are darker corners. A constable records a brawl that began when a peddler sold a lump twice mixed with soot and gum. A sailor curses an evening that left him dull for 2 days. A guild master dismisses an apprentice who prefers backroom smoke to morning orders. The plant is innocent of these choices, but the ledger does not care. It cares only that names are written in the right column. Medieval accounting, moral and monetary, likes totals. By the late Middle Ages, the distance between field and ocean has shortened. Empires, nautical and commercial, are built on fibers that do not fail, and hemp holds its place among the nation's vertebrae. In shipyards where ribs of oak rise from sawdust like prayers answered, cables as thick as a man's wrist coil at dockside with the implacable weight of preparation. That far future in which caravels will push past known maps is already implicit in these coils. When sails turn the horizon into a machine, the plant's quiet life will suddenly touch the edges of the world. For now, though, Europe is still mostly a walking place. Cloisters sing, plows cut the same furrows they have always cut. Saints' bones travel from town to town at a pace set by mules. Between the stone of cathedral and the thatch of cottage, the plant practices its old, unglamorous talents tying, binding, softening, easing. The church inveighs, the marketplace negotiates, the household decides. It is the usual arrangement, and it explains how something can be both frowned upon and indispensable for a very long time if you need one final image to understand the medieval bargain. Imagine a bell rope at Vespers hemp, twisted, tarred where hands sweat most, rough enough to grip without slipping. A young monk pulls, the rope hums, the bell above translates muscle into sound, and the town remembers what hour it is. The same plant, in the same parish, waits in a jar on a shelf a green oil for the joiner's wrist that aches after planing oak for the new pews. Sound and salve, duty and mercy, fiber and seed. Europe is built from such paired things, and the plant, unfashionable and undismissed, remains precisely because it can be both. The Renaissance wakes Europe like a hand opening a shutter, and in the bright new air shipyards begin to sound like cathedrals. Oak ribs rise, pitch warms in iron pots, and coils of hemp as thick as a man's wrist squat at the waterline like patient animals. Before philosophers discovered new stars with polished lenses, carpenters and rope makers teach wind to behave. The plant that once tied buckets and bell clappers now learns the ocean's grammar sheet. Brace, halyard, fall. A good cable is prayer made practical. It must not snap when winter puts its full weight on it. Whole regions become famous for fiber. North of the Baltic, fields lift a blue-green haze in summer. In autumn, the stalks are retted, broken, heckled, spun until they sing between thumb and forefinger. Bundles stamped with their port of origin travel by river and sledge and hull to yards where men in tar-stiffened tunics can judge quality by the sound a coil makes when dropped. A shipmaster shopping for cordage is as particular as a goldsmith choosing stones. He thinks in the storms. Across the Atlantic, colonies bow to the same necessity. In the chill, difficult fields of a raw coast, planters are told firmly by governors to sow hemp with their hopes. Flax for shirts, hemp for lines. The instruction appears in tidy records and stern letters because navies do not exist without a string. Even the proudest admirals end their orders with a dependence on knots. Farther south and west, missions and farms along new frontiers add the plant to their careful lists of staples. It is not romantic. That is its strength. The age of sail is a poem only at a distance. Up close, it is a world of tasks, and hemp belongs to tasks. Meanwhile, in workshops far from the sea, papers multiply. The recipe has matured rag and hemp and patience. Printers feed sheets through presses whose wooden frames creak like friendly doors. And suddenly, ideas begin to travel faster than caravans. The plant that once lay quietly under inked prayers now also carries diagrams of machines, engravings of strange beasts, and essays arguing about what truly makes a state. If you pressed a thumb to the corner of the century, you could feel it turning. Medicine returns in earnest. Apothecaries' shelves crowd with glass, each label a polite promise laudanum, spirit of Mindererus, syrup of poppies, and among them a darker tincture steeped from leaves and resin, imported with the same reliability as pepper and indigo. Doctors of the new, practical sort write case notes by lamplight, a spasm settled, a cough softened, a sleepless mind persuaded to let morning arrive. They argue about dose, as good doctors always do, about the difference between relief and laziness, about the patient's own character, which, in those rooms, still counts as a medicine or a poison. Across the water and over land, in warm cities where twilight lingers on lattice work, physicians who have known the plant for lifetimes write in steadier tones. They prescribe it in tiny cakes and bitter draughts, never as a carnival, but as a tool, as precise in their hands as a cautery iron. In some places, scholars gather to examine not only humors and herbs, but reports what helps a seizure loosen its grip, what grants a dying person an hour without fear. The plant's file grows thicker and more complicated. So does the world's patience for complexity. The ocean shrinks, galleons, carracks, then leaner frigates discover how far can be. Sails go up like pale wings, rigging takes on the low groan of tension. A cutter leaves a home river and comes back with another river in its mouth, a taste of nutmeg or rumor. In the gunroom, a surgeon counts his needles and his files. The sea is hard on backs and nerves, and a little bottle with a hand-lettered label sits where it can be reached in a hurry. The work of discovery is not only charts and flags, it is also sleep for the worn and quiet for those who have none. Curiosity, which in one century hunts new routes, in the next hunts new sensations. In drawing rooms smudged with coal smoke, a small circle of poets and painters begin to treat a greenish paste like a riddle they can eat. They meet in borrowed parlors, put spoons to their tongues, and wait for the room to rearrange itself into revelation. Results vary. A few write pages that glow like a stained glass. More of them produce sentences that look like unspooled thread in the morning. Even their disappointments add to a feeling that the age has options now. Not only obligations, the city itself seems to participate gaslight on wet streets. Printing presses still warm at midnight, a new appetite for the mind as a theater. At the same time, the factory has been invented, and with it, a daily fatigue no sermon can cure. Clerks sit bent at tall desks. Machinists hold their shoulders against the rhythm of belts. Seamstresses work until the muscles forget what the rest position is. Bottles in shop windows promise rest, appetite, composure. Among them, neat brown glass containing a solution dark as tea. The label is modest, the relief, for some, is immodest enough to keep business alive. Those who cannot afford bottles roll their own experiments out of whatever is at hand and earn. As the newly printed pamphlets like to say, consequences. Empires who prefer subjects tidy and taxes predictable notice the looseness and begin to worry. In one office, a report arrives weighing habit against harm fields that need laborers, courts that need less laughter, soldiers that need to rise at dawn. The conclusion is dry and long, its recommendation cautious. In another office, the conclusion is short and loud, restrict, fine, forbid. A governor pens an edict elegant enough to sound like reason and posts it at crossings where the wind plays with it, but the age cannot be legislated into certainty. On one street, a doctor continues to fill out forms in a hand learned at a proper school, noting improvements in a patient whose pain had turned personality into a job. On the next street, a magistrate listens to a case about a brawl that was started in a back room and thinks, not for the first time, that evenings are hard on men. Newspapers develop a taste for tidy morality tales, genius undone by indulgence, a promising student dulled by sweets. A mother's grief and audiences reward them with pennies and nods. Yet the numbers in ledgers tell a blunter story, mostly rope, mostly cloth, mostly ordinary medicine used by ordinary people for ordinary reasons. History has never been good at voting for the ordinary. By the final decades of the 19th century, the plant sits in two chairs at once. In the pharmacy, it is a tool among tools. In salons and courts, it is a question wearing too much perfume. Doctors who grew up examining pulses with 3 fingers now have stethoscopes and thermometers. They like instruments that do not sing. Some begin to prefer powders with names that sound like arithmetic. Meanwhile, binders of medical journals on dark wood shelves hold case after careful case where a drop under the tongue or a pellet on the gum meant a manageable night, a meal eaten, a fear stepped back from at sea. Hemp remains literal infrastructure. Nations court it the way they court timber and iron. Wars can be won or lost on whether a fleet has enough cordage that doesn't rot, and horse teams groan bringing bales into ports where politics smell like salt. The plant's usefulness is invisible precisely because it is so visible. No one writes an ode to a stay that does not part. The ship that carries elegiac poets to warmer coasts does so because someone redded stalks in a good pond at the right time of year. It is not romance, romance rides on it. What changes, finally, is not the plant, but the century's taste in control. New laws written in dense paragraphs only lawyers love begin to classify, schedule, stamp, and seal. Some speak to real harms, some speak to the fear of evenings one cannot supervise. A few are drafted out of an old prejudice that anything pleasing must be suspect unless taxed by the right office. The language grows medical when it wishes to narrow. It grows moral when it wishes to scold. Between those voices, ordinary use keeps happening: a mother's hand on a bottle by a bed, a sailor's knife cutting a new splice, a printer's apprentice laying damp sheets to dry, and so the long arc of the plant's European story bends toward the modern, from field to rope walk, from jar to drawer, from temple breath to factory cough. It has been an accomplice to survival more than a herald of collapse. If there is a lesson in its centuries of work, it is a simple one. Most of the world is held together by fibers and favors that do not make the speeches. The next age, louder, more certain of its own purity, will try to speak for it. The plant, indifferent to speeches, will do what it has always done, become whatever the day requires, and wait until the day remembers why. Rome, 1480. Incense, dust, and ambition drift in equal measure through the alleys behind the Vatican, where the city wears its contradictions as easily as perfume. In a townhouse owned by a cardinal who smiles as if favor were a currency he prints himself, a child is born, Lucrezia Borgia, gold-haired, watchful, and destined to live inside other people's plans. Her father is Rodrigo Borgia, a Spaniard with a Roman soul whose appetite for power will soon push him onto the highest throne in Christendom as Pope Alexander VI. Her mother, Vanozza de Catane, worldly and composed, understands that in this Rome, virtue is a garment you choose depending on the weather. From the start, Lucrezia is less a daughter than a possibility. Deals are whispered over her cradle. She is educated as a lady and decipher Latin, music, poetry, the choreography of a court where a smile must be as precise as a dagger. Tutors praise her penmanship and her memory for names, the two instruments of survival in a city that keeps its ledgers in both ink and blood. When Rodrigo becomes Alexander VI in 1492, the Vatican changes temperature. Piety acquires a family crest. Cardinals measure their futures against the Pope's children: Cesare, brilliant and dangerous; Juan, glittering and doomed; Joffre, malleable; and Lucrezia, the most negotiable. Rome gossips. Rome calculates. Rome bows. Before she's 12, 2 engagements fail the way alliances fail when the wind changes. The lesson is, plain affection is a word for poets. Utility moves the world. At 14, she is married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, useful for today's geometry of power, which binds papal Rome to the Sforza web in the north. The wedding is a festival of silk and certainty torches, music, and vows spoken in rooms where everyone pretends the future is a promise instead of a negotiation. Lucrezia performs her role flawlessly: grace, deference, a voice pitched just low enough to be irresistible. But alliances that begin the day a treaty needs signing die the day a better treaty appears. The Borgia compass swings. Giovanni senses it first. Fear turns him loud. He flees Rome and, to hurt what he cannot keep, accuses his wife and her father of a sin so spectacular that the story is guaranteed to leave incest. Rome, which eats scandal for breakfast, lets the rumor feed it. What follows is one of those moments when canon law and theater meet on a narrow bridge. Alexander VI petitions for annulment on grounds of non-consummation. Giovanni sputters, witnesses swear to what no one can truly know. Physicians are called, dignity dismissed, truth sent to fetch itself a cloak. In the official record, the marriage is undone because the husband could not be a husband. In the unofficial record, the one written on faces and retold in courtyards, everyone chooses the version that flatters their politics. Lucrezia says little. She walks through the center of the argument, looking like innocence wearing a veil, and watches doors open because that's what they do for the silent. If fate ever offered her softness, it arrives with Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, illegitimate kin to the King of Naples, handsome, nearer her age, and blessed with that rarest of courtly talents, kindness. Their match is a geometry lesson again, Rome and Naples, papacy and crown. But for a season, the angles admit warmth. They have a son, Rodrigo, and for a little while Rome imagines a gentler ending for a Borgia woman. Then the map shifts. Cesare, newly allied with France, needs Naples diminished. Alfonso becomes inconvenient in the way candles are inconvenient to the sun. One evening in 1500, assassins find him on the steps of St. Peter's. Steel flashes, he survives by a stitch, and the city holds its breath while he heals under a roof guarded by papal men. Healing, however, is not in the plan. Stranglers finish what knives began. The official story limps. Rome supplies its own Cesare's agents, the Pope's approval, Lucrezia's tears authentic, performative. Who can say the truth drowns in a fountain of rumor and never floats again? In the meantime, the Vatican runs like a family firm with a supernatural letterhead. Cesare administers affairs with an efficiency that frightens Europe. Alexander VI dispenses benefices as if he had invented generosity. Lucrezia, the gentlest instrument, is entrusted with what men call women's work when they fear to admit. It is the work of state letters that ease quarrels, receptions that tilt loyalties, conversations that carry promises disguised as compliments. She becomes the still surface of a dangerous lake. Ambassadors report that she is sweet, reserved, charming. Their postscripts are another matter, crowded with speculation. The whispers wrap themselves around a swaddled infant known in Roman parlance as the infans Romanus, a child whose paternity will be a riddle with the Borgia name arranged on every possible answer. Lucrezia's reputation, already a courtesan of rumor, acquires another lover. And yet, beyond the pamphlets and poems, there is the person, a young mother writing careful notes about her child's health, a daughter who longs for affection from a father whose love is indistinguishable from policy, a sister whose brilliant brother treats tenderness like a foreign language. He doesn't have time to learn. When the weight is too much, she retreats for a time to a convent, part piety, part tactic, where silence and order can apply ointment to a life made raw by attention. Cynics say she hides. Kinder observers say she breathes. Both may be right. The city, meanwhile, continues to perform its favorite drama, holiness in the morning, appetite in the afternoon, regret at vespers, and gossip until the lamps go out. As Lucrezia emerges again into the play, the boards are reset. Rome needs a story of rehabilitation. Ferrara needs money, papal favor, and the glamour of a notorious daughter turned acceptable duchess, Alfonso d'Este, heir to one of northern Italy's most cultivated houses, is practical enough to clasp a hand. Everyone else is still busy judging. The bargain is arranged with the speed of weather. Lucrezia will leave Rome. She will take with her wagons heavy with gold, musicians, jewelers, and a past that arrives before she does. Before that departure, the Borgia arc must break. In 1503, Alexander VI dies suddenly, spectacularly, according to some accounts leaving Rome to choose quickly between grief and opportunity. The city chooses opportunity and calls it grief. Cesare, stripped of the oxygen that only his father could supply, watches the web he has spun tremble, slacken, and cut his hands. Enemies who held their breath now inhale deeply. The Borgia weather vanes reverse. Lucrezia sees what wind can do to a house built on a single name and does the only prudent thing available to her. She steps out of the weather. But if her first decades were spent as a pawn, they were not spent asleep. She has learned the secret curriculum: when to speak, when to be rumored, how to turn survival into style. She will carry it north to Ferrara, where a court trained to smell a scandal at 100 paces will first wrinkle its nose and then slowly, almost against its will, learn another scent competence. The duchess she will become is already visible. In outline, a patron with taste, a diplomat with lace at her cuffs, a mother with a leger. Yet none of that is promised. For now the wagons are being loaded. For now Rome rehearses its last lines about her. A city that never quite forgave her for being useful also never stopped using her. She's 22 years old. Before the road unrolls, she visits a chapel where candles throw small kingdoms of light onto painted saints. It pleases us to imagine that she prays for absolution, or for safety, or perhaps only for quiet. What she asks for may be simpler: an hour without spectators. Rome rarely grants such things. Ferrara might. And so, the girl who was a treaty, the widow who was a lesson, the bride who was a rumor, prepares to become something else entirely, not redeemed, not erased, but rearranged. If history loves transformation, it is because transformation allows the past to keep its stories while the present goes on living. Lucrezia, who has learned to hold both at once, steps into the carriage. The road to Ferrara is long enough for a reputation to travel ahead of a carriage. Before Lucrezia passes the Po, poems about her arrive wrapped in sighs. Letters about her arrive wrapped in warnings. Alfonso d'Este, heir and then duke, does not read sighs. He reads inventories: powder, culverins, bronze to be cast, wheat to be stored when rivers sulk. He meets his bride with the tact of a man who trusts metal more than rumor. Ferrara, walled and water-laced, is prepared to tolerate a Borgia because Ferrara is very good at tolerating what brings advantage. The wagons come first cloth, gold plate, musicians, tapestries that turn bare stone into stories, and then the woman, small-boned, composed, carrying calm as if it were a kind of invisible jewelry. At court, the nostrils flare, poison in the rings, a smile that means arsenic. These are lines too delicious to leave unwritten. They are repeated with ceremony, like grace before a meal. But daily life has the stubborn habit of undermining a script. Lucrezia rises early. She writes, she listens, she learns the names of the men who carry trays and the women who prepare rooms. She knows that administrations are held together, not by edicts, but by people who know where the keys are kept. When ambassadors enter, they find not a siren, but a secretary of state with velvet sleeves. She remembers what they mentioned last time, the cousin with a fever, the wine from home they miss, and she returns the talk to business so gently they are grateful for the rescue. Ferrara helps her become herself. The Este have educated taste like a kind of second catechism. Their court has long been a magnet for wit and craft. Printers set elegant type in the streets that the smell of bread and oil. In the palaces, lutes taste their strings in cool afternoons. A poet reads new lines and waits, hand at his mouth, for the sigh that means he has aimed well. Musicians from the north and the plains arrive with manuscripts and accents. Composers rehearse motets in stairwells because the stairwells improve the sound. A painter adjusts blue until a Madonna seems to breathe. Lucrezia fits inside this machinery of refinement not as an ornament, but as a gear. She engages, she pays, she chooses. Her ear favors the clear line, her eye favors balance over bravura. Dedications bloom in prefaces to the most serene Duchess, to the protector of letters, to one whose judgment refines what it receives. When Alfonso is away, the artillery duke forever traveling the map's hard grammar, she takes counsel and gives it. Dispatches arrive from Venice, Mantua, Rome. She reads them, considers where favor is an investment and where it is a sieve. She writes back in a hand admired even by enemies because a beautiful sentence is diplomatic in itself. When a quarrel threatens to turn into a lawsuit that might turn into a skirmish, she stages a dinner instead, arranges the seating the way a general arranges front lines, and lets music do the work of temperament. Later, the envoy writes home that Ferrara is well governed because its duchess knows that peace kept is cheaper than peace bought. There is still Rome in her, how could there not be? But it is Rome translated into another key. She understands the speed of rumor, how news travels faster when the messenger wishes it to be true. She inoculates against this with visibility the public walk in the gardens, the chapel appearances, the charities counted out with care. Silver coins her own go to convent kitchens where soup turns winter from an enemy into a fact, guild's petition. She signs, girls with no dowry find one. A scribe lays a ledger before her and she adds a column because a mind trained in survival always keeps track. Across Italy, the weather is unkind, alliances knot and unspool. A pope who hated her father reaches for cities as if they were beads. Another pope calculates with gentler hands and a stricter books. Soldiers learn the terrifying new eloquence of gunpowder. Alfonso's cannon, famous and feared, keep Ferrara from becoming a lesson. Lucrezia keeps Ferrara from becoming a headline. The pair iron and ink make something that passes for safety in a century that mistrusts the word. And yet, the old shadows trail her like a perfume that refuses to go flat. Visitors look past the frescoes and ask, in lowered voices that are really raised ones, whether the Duchess keeps a vial in her jewel box with contents more interesting than a scent. They admire the composure and then mistrust it. They admire the politeness and then translate it into strategy. Some cannot forgive a woman for surviving magnificently. Others cannot forgive her for simply surviving. Lucrezia, who cannot live on other people's forgiveness, lives on labor. She reads to her children in the afternoon and corrects a steward's figures in the evening, and, when the city wakes to a rumor that it would have eaten a smaller house, she sits for a portrait and makes patience look inevitable. Letters move like a bloodstream. To Mantua, where a sister-in-law weighs her own glory with admirable frankness, she sends compliments fluted like columns, and requests wrapped in congratulations. To Venice, where the Republic keeps its own counsel behind law and counting, she sends little gifts, a delicacy, a caged bird, a turn of phrase anyone would be pleased to quote. To Rome, she sends something harder proof that Ferrara is an ally when allies are counted by tonnage and by taste. An envoy returns reporting that he saw the Duchess at Vespers looking more nun than Borgia. The remark is passed around as if it were a new recipe. If reputation is a fabric, she keeps darning the same tier until the pattern holds. Her circle is not all calculation. There are afternoons of easy laughter with poets who know how to be witty without being cruel. There is the long, careful companionship with the mind of letters, who writes to her of language as if it were a garden, and replies to her with a gentleness untrained men mistake for weakness. A lock of hair changes hands and is kept where poems are kept. It will outlive them both, which is the hair's habit in history. Musicians dedicate motates that flower and decay, as all living sound does, and the Duchess listens with the ache of anyone who has learned how brief even a perfect minute is. The city watches her grieve because grief is difficult to keep private in a palace. News arrives from Naples like a rope that breaks in the hand the boy from her second marriage. Her Rodrigo is dead at 12. The letter that tells her is stiff with protocol. The words inside it are not. She folds it once, then again, as if smaller paper would make a smaller pain. In the chapel she prays. In the accounts, she crosses out a budget line meant for gifts at his next name day. Courtiers who once traded in her blushes now trade in her silences. And for a time, even the least tactful learn to remove their hats where she walks. After sorrow, duty, it is unromantic, which is why it works. A city needs banal miracles grain in bad months, drains that remember which way water wishes to go, seasonal festivals that stitch citizens to place. She supervises new cloths for the cathedral. She approves a fountain that turns a square into belonging. A printer shows her a proof so elegant she smiles without meaning to, and a whole shop of men feel as if they had slept. Alfonso returns dusted with campaign and finds a household that does not make him choose between his pride and his dinner. Whispers can be generous too. Machiavelli will later write of princes and appearances and the machinery of power, but envoys already alive to such thinking remark that Ferrara's Duchess has a way of making advantage look like courtesy. She does not invent this. She refines it. The Borgia talent for prevailing becomes, in her hands, the Este talent for enduring. It is a subtler music, and it ages better. Years accumulate, as they do even in the houses of the fortunate. Children arrive and are christened with names that carry dynasties like cloaks. Some thrive, some do not. Miscarriages fold the calendar back on itself. Lucrezia's body does what women's bodies have always done for states, carries continuities at cost. She keeps her faith tidy and unannounced. Where once she fled to a convent to escape Rome's appetite, now she goes to a convent because it is a place where work sounds like prayer and prayer sounds like rest. She endows a chapel. She balances the convent accounts with the same neat care she gives to the duchies. The city, which once braced itself for scandal, has learned a different reflex respect, not the loud kind that needs trumpets, but the kind that makes men speak more softly in a doorway when she passes. Ferrara's enemies still exist. Her allies still need tending. The peninsula still invents new reasons for old quarrels. But the Duchess has done what few in her time managed. She made a life out of a legend without letting the legend eat the life. There are hints, late in these years of competence and light, that the body will not forgive being asked to be both banner and bridge. Fevers leave her emptied. Sometimes, rising from prayer, she sways before she steadies herself on a pew polished by other hands. Still she attends to the day. She understands the arithmetic of hours. She spends them where they buy durability. People who never tire of gossip tire of their own cruelty when faced with a woman who simply keeps offering the world her work. What Rome once murmured about her serpent, angel, siren, pawn, Ferrara replaces with plainer nouns, mother, patron, duchess. If there is an alchemy here, it is not miraculous. It is made of letters sent on time, of festivals well planned, of wages paid, of a lamp tended before dawn so a column of figures can be trusted after lunch. The miracle, if we insist on one, is patience that looks like grace. The century will not leave her that peace for long, but for a stretch of years in the old brick city by the slow river, Lucrezia Borgia is exactly what history rarely allows its favorite gossip to be useful, beloved, and almost left alone. By the time winter leaned across the Po for the 10th time since she came to Ferrara, Lucrezia had made herself both visible and necessary. The city had learned her cadence: mornings of paper and petition, afternoons of music or catechism, evenings of small councils that looked like suppers. The legend that had arrived with her wagons grew thin where it rubbed against the grain of ordinary work. But the body keeps its own account book, and it had begun to present a bill. Fevers came and went like unwelcome courtiers. There were days when she rose slowly, as if the floor had moved in the night, and steadied herself with a hand on a window mullion. Still, letters went out in her elegant hand. Still, quibbles over water rights and customs duties were settled, and a quarrel over precedence at a civic procession was smoothed with 2 extra garlands and a shared canopy. Alfonso, returning from an inspection of cannon castings that scorched the air with the scent of metal, found a household that ran without noise. The engineers brought him measurements. The Duchess brought him an accounts page balanced to the lost coin. Iron and ink their arrangement of peace. Ferrara's cultural machinery, already brilliant, burned brighter in her long middle years. Ludovico Ariosto read passages of a romance that seemed to contain every forest in Christendom and every heart's mistake. Courtiers laughed in the right places and went home repeating stanzas until the words felt like a charm. Dosso Doshi painted figures whose draperies knew secrets. Choir books arrived, their black notes blooming like vines across cream parchment. The Duchess's taste, measured, clear, more attentive to structure than the spectacle, gave such works the frame they needed. Dedications multiplied to the serene lady, to the sure hand, to she whose discernment chastens our rashness. That was always part of her alchemy, to make admiration sound like correction, and correction like a gift. The city watched her pray. It was not the penitential theater Rome adored, no fasting announced, no hair shirts displayed like trophies, but a daily fidelity that made faith look like housekeeping. Convents found their lamps filled and their accounts squared. A new set of linens, immaculate and unboasting, appeared in a ward for the poor. When the river sulked and trade carts arrived late and the market thinned, her almoners loosened strings on their purses. Her seal in red wax became, for many, the difference between hunger postponed and hunger obeyed. In 1518, the sadness that had been following at a distance closed the gap. A run of illnesses left her drawn and quiet. Yet the Duchess, who had negotiated away a war over the placement of a bride's chair at a wedding, still sent careful instructions on a harvest festival, the order of the banners, the measure of the psalm, the extra basket for the orphaned boy who had learned to yoke oxen with a craftsman's concentration. There were also letters to her eldest surviving son, Ercole, now taking the first awkward steps into governance. They are lost to us, but we know their shape counsel in the grammar of tenderness. A mother is tutoring concealed as a statecraft. A reminder that the most expensive thing in any polity is a promise made without counting the cost. In June of 1519, labor, her 10th, came like a tide and did not recede cleanly. The child, a girl, was still born. The fever that followed paid no attention to rank. Physicians came with their syrups and cautions, muttered in learned Latin what experience already knew, and withdrew. The city, which had long ago learned to lower its voice when grief walked by, lowered it further. Lucrezia, who had become accustomed to carrying other people's dread without letting them see her bend, now asked for a chaplain. Accounts from those last days describe no drama. She confessed, received the sacrament, and sent away the bustle of concern so that the room could be small enough for honesty. She had loved children and music, a few friends, and the relief of exact work. She had been slandered by the lazy and praised by the precise. She had managed to transform a story written for her into a story written by her. And the price had been as it is, for everyone paid in private. On June 24th, 1519, at 39, she died. Ferrara mourned as a city does when grief and gratitude arrive holding hands. The bells spoke the old language over roofs and ovens. Shopkeepers leaned in their doorways. A scribe paused over his italic hand and found that the letter he was forming had turned into a tear. Alfonso, more made of flint than of ash, walked through rooms arranged by a mind he had come to trust, and stood for a time in a silence that respected both the dead and the work of those still alive. They buried her in the convent of Corpus Domini, the place she had supplied quietly for years, where the floor stones remembered the feet that cared for them. It suited her better than any triumphal monument. Intimacy, order, prayer. Death did not end the story. It changed narrators. Rome, which cannot bear to leave a legend unembroidered, threaded new colors into the fabric. pamphlets and poems rehearsed the old insults because they are the easiest kind to write. Painters imagined her with a poison ring because emblem is simpler than audit. 3 centuries later, a French poet turned dramatist would present her as doom made blonde. An Italian composer would give that doom a voice and watch audiences tremble in velvet seats. These were not portraits, they were mirrors held up to the fears of their times, but mirrors, too, have their truth. They show you what you expect to see. Meanwhile, the paper record, the dry, stubborn paper, preserved other lines, lists of dowries paid for girls with nothing but honest hands, memoranda on grain of storage, letters whose margins hold the courtesy that keeps a negotiation from becoming a quarrel, ambassadors who came primed for sensation, left talking about competence, Machiavelli, who prized appearances while insisting one should understand what lay beneath them, would have recognized the craft she made utility graceful and grace useful. If her father had specialized in force and her brother in fear, she specialized in duration. The Borgia art of prevailing became, under her hand, the Este art of lasting. What, then, was she? The words that survive for women who work are always insufficient. Angel, serpent, siren. Pawn, Rome's lexicon for Lucrezia, was a glossary of the city's appetites masquerading as analysis. Ferrara generated a quieter vocabulary patron. Mother, duchess, history, which punishes nuance with neglect and rewards caricature with immortality, preferred the Roman version for a long time. Now the balance is different. Scholars with patience instead of daggers and archives instead of pamphlets have gathered up the receipts she left behind, the ledger, the signature, the schedule. The figure that emerges is not a monster after all, nor a plaster saint. She's a governor whose jurisdiction happened to include her own name. It is tempting to assign her a redemption story, to cast Ferrara as absolution granted for Roman sins. She would not have recognized herself in that fable. There was too much calculation in her kindness, too much kindness in her calculation. For morality plays, what she built in the north did not cleanse the south, it simply made south less decisive. She did not out-argue rumor, she outlasted it. She did not escape myth, she has stepped around it long enough to plant a garden and pay the gardeners on time. Visit the convent today and you will find quiet, more eloquent than any epitaph. The air smells faintly of a stone and beeswax. A small, disciplined light falls across the floor. Somewhere behind the grill, the hours continue prime, terse, sexed exact as a well-kept budget. In that rhythm, you can hear something of the woman herself, a life shaped to a rule that does not advertise itself, a belief that the sacred can be found in the correct placing of a chair as often as in a vision. Ferrara taught her that. Perhaps she taught Ferrara the same. And Rome went on, as Rome does, with a different spectacle, where her childhood city sought its transcendence in rumor and procession. It had once sought it in a speed and sand. There, long before her name drew crowds, a charioteer's triumph could quiet a city, and a crash could set it on fire. The arena that held those tempests, stone for the people. Air for the gods waits in our story like a shout behind a door. To open it is to step into another kind of heartbeat, the thunder of hooves and approval. But first, the carriage that carried Lucrezia north recedes into the distance, and the street behind it closes. The Duchess is at rest. The crowd's noise, another crowd. Another century rises. You step through the door, and the quiet of Ferrara gives way to a different weather sun burning on pale sand. Brass, bright as noon, breath held with thousands of others. The Circus Maximus does not begin. It arrives from the Palatine's shadow to the Aventine's slope. Stone embraces an oval of dust so vast it looks like a riverbed, emptied of water and filled with hunger. They say it stretched nearly 2,000 Roman feet end to end, long enough for a rumor to be born at one curve and die of old age at the other. By the time the trumpets wake the morning, the city has already poured into its terraces, senators under awnings, artisans leaning on knees, bakers with flour still at their wrists, children tasting salt from the cured olives their mothers have packed. It is worship without doctrine, and the god is speed. The theater of it is deliberate. Before any gate groans open, the Pompa Circensis files past like a miniature empire. Priests carry laurel branches, musicians test notes that will later drown out the screams. There are statues of gods borne on litters so heavy the bearers' rhythms set the day's metronome. And somewhere behind them, a slave steps carefully with a shallow tray of white cloth, the mappa that will, at the system's limit, become a signal. The factions pass in their colors: red, white, green, blue. What began as a stable livery has become an identity so intimate, even infants are swaddled in it. On some mornings, you can see a husband and wife in rival scarves watching the same gate, proof that love and loyalty are separate currencies. The track itself is a geometry of risk. Down its spine stands the spina, that long island of masonry and meaning where obelisks stolen from old kingdoms pierce the air and shrines look on with a patience the crowd does not share. Bronze dolphins and stone eggs perch on plinths. Each lap, a boy will tip one to mark the turning of the world. At either end, the metae, those triple cones of the stone, assert a rule everyone wants to break: turn wide and live, turn tight and win. The starting end is all machinery. 12 corsairs crouch with their latticed barriers ready to spring. They fan outward, numbered and argued over for generations. And the rope and pulley logic that drops the gates in a single breath might be the most honest thing in Rome. If it fails, everyone sees. Then the mappa falls and the city learns what a heartbeat is for. 12 teams explode from the courtyards like seeds loosed from a dry pod. It is a violent clarity. Quadrant wheels rattle, sand leaps like a swarmed shore, and the driver's origi become a wrists and eyes. The reins bite into their waists, looped there so 4 horses can be made one animal, and the knife they carry at the hip, small, curved, almost tender to look at, remains close for the moment when iron turns traitor and leather must be cut. The horses have names that children carve into walls: Lightning, Seafoam, Africanus. The inside horse feels the pull of the turn. The outside horse knows glory lives where the air bites. Between them is the driver's guess about tomorrow. Speed proves things nothing else can. It proves the man from Lusitania, Gaius Apuleius Diocles, could gather victories into a fortune so ridiculous that even senators dropped their eyes when it was named. It proves the boy Scorpus, a golden and not yet hardened into his own cunning, could be loved by fistfuls of Rome and die at 26 in a heap of wood and hoof and prayer. The crowds memorize the order of their lashes, the fractional angle of their shoulders at the metae, the superstitions they whisper into the mouths of mayors. Fandom becomes a species of literacy. Factions become miniature republics with accountants and spies. There are men whose work it is to shout correctly. The laps tick down, dolphins turning one by one. 7 is an ancient number here, lucky even when luck is busy elsewhere. By the 4th lap, the field begins to arrange itself a blue quadriga that has wasted a perfect start by drifting wide, a green that has taught its opponents to believe there is more room than there is, a red that hovers behind, husbanding a final burst of clarity. The metae gather sacrifice because they must. The crash is not a surprise, it is a ritual with its own grammar. A wheel bites the spina, lifts, and grammar becomes biography, naufragium. The crowd cries a shipwreck because everything in Rome is a sea metaphor when breath is scarce. A driver goes under, another rides on, the calculus of victory underwritten by indifference. Women covered their faces and then look. Men shout the name of a god and then the name of a driver as if they were the same thing. The musicians play because they always play when blood is being moved for safety. Around the edges of the spectacle, Rome conducts its other business. Betting is not a vice here, it is a language. The old woman in the 3rd tier, who has not trusted a magistrate since she was 12, places 3 sestertii on a white team's promise of constancy and mutters an oath she has never given a man. A baker wagers a month of grain on a boy he once saw practice at dawn and believes that memory is a form of research. Wealthy men treat coin as a speech, testing each other's nerves in public and paying with a smile they can afford. Inside information is a commodity engineered like bronze. A stable hand's cough is worth a ring. Bookmen carry wax tablets that grow heavier, not with entries, but with probability. Politics cannot resist a crowd disobedient to attention. Emperors adopt factions the way new fathers adopt lullabies. Caligula eats among the blues and calls it honesty. Nero stages a victory in the one sport that will not allow him to lose. And Rome, generous in its way, despises him properly as long as the bread arrives. The circus becomes a barometer with hooves. If the people cheer the emperor's gift of games, taxation may be tightened a notch next week. If they boo at a mismanaged spectacle, even marble can hear the temperature drop. Men who intend to be obeyed practice listening here because silence in this place means the city is deciding something without them. The engineering of the thing would have pleased the gods if they were as scrupulous as augurs said. Floodgates channel the Tiber to wash the track. Drains carry away the day's pieces of ruin. A timing system older than reason keeps the dolphins honest. Vendors move like currents, selling vinegar water and dates and a sausage so coarse you can taste the field it came from. Children learn both arithmetic and cruelty by counting laps and crashes. Lovers learn how to be conspirators by spying seats left conveniently empty. For all its fever, the circus is a masterpiece of management, an empire scaled to a morning and made to fit inside everyone's eyes at once. And yet, like every system that treats thrill as if it were grain, it begins to fail not with a bang, but with a budget. Christianity does not kill the circus, cost does. Bishops call it vanity, and the bishops are sometimes right. But it is the accounts hay for the stables, bronze for repairs, prizes that must be new if gratitude is to be fresh, that finally make treasurers more afraid than governors are. Imperial patronage thins. Factions. Once corporations with sacred colors become creditors with shabby banners. The Gothic wars march history up to the arena's gates. Famine dampens the appetite for a spectacle. The Espina's obelisks are removed like jewelry pawned by a family that refuses to say the word poverty. Weeds, which never read edicts, go about their patient business. What remains is a shape in the earth and a rumor in the mind. Walk there now and you will find a park, names carved by tourists into time that does not belong to them. A dog asleep where once 1,000 gamblers held their breath. Stand at one end and the ghost of the Mite still insists us on a turn. Stand at the other and an old chair moves a grain of dust. Rome keeps its indiscretions and its devotions with equal fervor. The circus belongs to both lists. It showed the city what it loved about itself: courage, skill, noise, and what it would forgive death that looked like art. It taught emperors to flatter and citizens to measure power by generosity and timing. It made humanity's appetite for risk look like a civic good. And sometimes it was the dust settles, the dolphins all lean the same way. Somewhere a horn sounds, but it is only a bus. The past recedes to its proper distance where it can be looked at without breaking. We have walked from a Stone Age fire to a Roman roar, from a duchess's ledger to an arena's arithmetic. The through line is simpler than any of our explanations, people, always improvising uses for what the world gives them: plant, rumor, stone, song. If there is a lesson in these pages, it is only that history is a crowd scene where you can hear one voice at a time if you lean close enough. Tonight we have leaned. Tomorrow the work resumes.